Imagine a kingdom so powerful it could raise armies, build palaces of stone, and command thousands of workers. Now imagine that same kingdom couldn't function without a shipment of metal from a mine 2,000 miles away. That's not a weakness in the story. That's the entire story. Because around 1200 BCE, some of the most advanced civilizations on Earth were only ever one missing shipment away from disaster. We tend to picture ancient kingdoms as self-contained. Egypt has the Nile. The Hittites have Anatolia. Mycenaean Greece has its palaces and its warriors. Separate worlds, separate stories. But that picture is wrong. Deeply wrong. The truth is, these civilizations were bound together by something almost invisible, something that doesn't show up in most of the history you learned in school. Trade, not casual trade, not luxury trade on the side. Trade that kept the entire system alive. Think about bronze for a second, the metal that gave this era its name. You can't make bronze from one material. You need copper, and you need tin. And here's the unsettling part. In the Eastern Mediterranean, those two materials were almost never in the same place. Copper might come from Cyprus. Tin might come from as far away as Afghanistan, passed hand to hand across 1,000 miles of intermediaries before it ever reached a Mycenaean workshop or a Hittite forge. Every sword, every plough blade, every ceremonial cup depended on a chain of ships and caravans and merchants that stretched across the known world. Now stretch that idea further. Grain moved this way too. Timber, ivory, precious stones, skilled labour, diplomatic marriages. Entire royal households depended on goods and materials that had to arrive from somewhere else on time, every time. This wasn't a world of isolated kingdoms occasionally trading surplus goods. This was a genuinely interconnected system, an early version of globalization where Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the city-states of the Levant were all locked together in something like an ancient supply chain. And that raises an unsettling question. What happens when a supply chain like that breaks? Because sometime around the 12th century BCE, this entire interconnected world came apart. Palaces burned, cities were abandoned, trade routes that had functioned for centuries simply went silent. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and for decades they've debated what caused it. Invaders, earthquakes, climate change, internal rebellion. All of these explanations have evidence behind them. But there's another thread running through the wreckage, one that doesn't get talked about enough. What if trade itself was the first domino? What if disruption in these fragile international networks didn't just accompany the collapse, but helped trigger it? That's what we're going to explore, not through vague generalities, but through the actual evidence. Shipwrecks lying on the Mediterranean floor, still packed with cargo after more than 3,000 years. Clay tablets from port cities, some containing desperate letters written in the final days before those cities fell silent forever. Ruined palace archives, changing patterns of pottery and metal that tell us who was trading with whom and when that trading stopped. It's a detective story written in fragments, and piece by piece, it points towards something enormous. Before we go further back into that world, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? I love reading those comments, half-asleep travellers checking in from every time zone on Earth. Put it in the comments below, and if you want the easiest way to fall asleep to these stories every night, follow the show on Spotify, listen there, and if you enjoy it, leave a 5-star review. The link is in the description. It genuinely helps keep these stories going. Now, let's go back to a time when the Eastern Mediterranean was thriving, when trade routes crossed the sea like arteries feeding a single vast body, and nobody yet knew how fragile that body truly was. Let's slow down and actually look at this world, not the way a textbook would show it, flat and labelled, but the way someone living in it might have understood it, as a set of relationships, a web of who depended on whom, who owed loyalty to whom, and who could ruin your entire year if their harvest failed or their minds went quiet. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean sometime in the 13th century BCE, drifting into the early 12th. This is the mature, confident phase of the Late Bronze Age, the moment right before everything we're about to describe starts unravelling. If you could somehow view it from above, really from above, like a map unrolled across a table, you'd see a handful of major powers anchoring the whole system. Start with Egypt in the south, along the Nile. By this point, Egypt is already ancient. Pyramids that would still stand today were already over 1,000 years old to the people living in this period. Egypt's pharaohs commanded enormous wealth, controlled trade routes into Nubia and the Sinai, and projected power northward into the Levant. Egypt didn't need much from outside its borders to feed itself. The Nile saw to that, but it needed timber it didn't have, and it wanted the prestige goods, the metals, the diplomatic relationships that made a pharaoh look like a pharaoh among his equals. Now move north and east, up into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and you find the Hittite Empire, landlocked in its heartland, built around a network of mountain passes and river valleys. Hatti was a military power, capable of matching Egypt on the battlefield, as they famously did around Kadesh. But the Hittites had a persistent problem. Their homeland wasn't especially fertile. They needed grain, and often that grain needed to come from somewhere else, sometimes from as far away as Egypt itself, a strange and telling detail we'll come back to later. Further east, along the Tigris and Euphrates, sat Assyria and Babylonia, two Mesopotamian powers with long histories of rivalry and cooperation in roughly equal measure. Assyria was rising in strength during this period, increasingly asserting itself as a player worth taking seriously. Babylonia carried the prestige of centuries of tradition, of Hammurabi's old legal legacy, of temples and scribal schools that had been training administrators for longer than most other kingdoms had existed at all. Across the water in the Aegean, you had Mycenaean Greece. Not a unified nation the way we think of nations today, but a collection of palace centres, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, each ruled by its own king, or one-axe, each commanding its own local economy, yet all sharing a common material culture, a common script for record-keeping, and apparently a shared appetite for imported goods from the Eastern Mediterranean. Sitting almost directly between all these powers, geographically and economically, was the island of Cyprus. Not a massive empire, not even a single unified kingdom for most of this period, but arguably one of the most important places on the entire map, because Cyprus had copper, enormous quantities of it, and copper, remember, was half the recipe for bronze. And along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, hugging the coastline of what's now Syria, Lebanon and Israel, sat the Levantine city-states. Places like Ugarit, Byblos and others, smaller in scale than Egypt or Hatti, but absolutely critical, because these cities functioned as the connective tissue of the entire system. Ports, warehouses, multilingual scribes, merchants who spoke 3 or 4 languages fluently because their livelihood depended on it. Now, here's the thing to really sit with. None of these powers existed in isolation. They were connected, physically connected, by a set of natural highways that the geography of the region practically demanded people use. The Mediterranean Sea itself was the biggest of these highways, a relatively calm, navigable body of water that made moving heavy cargo, like ingots of copper or jars of wine, far easier by ship than by land. A donkey caravan might carry a few £100. A single ship, even a modest one, could carry tons. Ports mattered enormously. because a port was where sea routes met land routes. A place like Ugarit sat at a natural junction, where ships arriving from Cyprus or Egypt could unload goods that would then travel inland along river valleys or through mountain passes toward Mesopotamia or Anatolia. Mountain passes mattered too, because Anatolia's interior, where the Hittites ruled, wasn't easily reached by sea. Armies, messengers and merchants had to funnel through specific corridors, which meant those corridors became points of enormous strategic value and enormous vulnerability. River routes tied the interior regions together the way the sea tied the coastal ones. The Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Orontes running through Syria. These weren't just sources of water and fertile soil. They were roads, arguably the most efficient roads available in the ancient world, since moving goods by river current required a fraction of the effort of moving them overland. So you have a landscape almost purpose-built for connection. Seas, ports, passes, and rivers, threading these powers together into something that functioned less like a scattering of separate kingdoms and more like a single interlocking system, however uneven and fragile that system might have been underneath its surface confidence. And holding this system together, at least in theory, was a very particular diplomatic order. Historians sometimes call it the Society of Great Kings. At the top sat a small handful of rulers, the Pharaoh of Egypt, the Hittite king, the king of Babylonia, sometimes Assyria's ruler too, who addressed each other as equals, as brothers, in the surviving diplomatic letters. They exchanged gifts, arranged marriages, sent physicians and craftsmen to one another's courts, and occasionally threatened each other with war when the gifts weren't generous enough. Below these great kings sat a wider network of lesser rulers. Client kings, vassal rulers, the men who governed places like Ugarit or the smaller city-states of the Levant. These rulers weren't equals in the great king's eyes. They were expected to pay tribute, provide soldiers when called upon, and stay loyal to whichever great power claimed authority over their region, which in practice meant walking a careful line between larger powers competing for influence. This mattered enormously for ordinary people who never set foot in a palace and never met a king. Because if the diplomatic relationship between, say, Hatti and Egypt shifted, a farmer in a small Levantine village might suddenly find soldiers marching through his fields, or a merchant might find his usual trading partners cut off by a war he had nothing to do with. Fought over politics he barely understood. A drought in Anatolia could mean grain ships from Egypt were suddenly the difference between stability and starvation, hundreds of miles away, for people who had never seen a pharaoh and never would. This is the world we're stepping into, interconnected, hierarchical, and utterly dependent on the assumption that ships would keep sailing, that passes would stay open, that great kings would keep honouring their letters. It looked, for a very long time, remarkably stable, which makes what happened next all the more unsettling. That confidence rested on something surprisingly specific. Not just on kings keeping promises, or ships finding their way safely from one harbour to another. It rested on metal, bronze. The name Late Bronze Age makes it sound almost obvious, like the people of this world simply happened to use bronze because that was what people used then. But bronze was not a thing you found lying in the ground. It had to be made, and making it meant connecting places that nature had placed very far apart. At its simplest, bronze is copper mixed with tin, usually mostly copper with a smaller amount of tin, often somewhere around 1 part tin to 9 parts copper, though ancient recipes varied. Heat them together, and you get a metal harder than copper alone, more durable, better at holding an edge, and easier to cast into useful shapes than many people realize. Copper is soft. You can hammer it. You can shape it. But a pure copper axe dulls quickly. A copper sword can bend. A farmer cutting grain with a copper sickle has a workable tool, but not necessarily a tool that stays sharp through hard use. Add tin, though, and the whole equation changes. Bronze can become an axe head that bites deeper into wood, a chisel that holds its shape, a spear point that does not deform as easily when it strikes bone, armour, or a shield, a sword that gives its owner a real advantage over someone carrying a softer weapon. And in the late Bronze Age, that advantage spread everywhere. Bronze made tools for farmers, carpenters, masons, shipbuilders, leatherworkers, and metalworkers themselves. It made sickles for harvest, knives for butchering, adzes for shaping timber, needles, pins, fishhooks, razors, cauldrons, and vessels. It made the fittings of chariots, it made weapons, from arrowheads and spear points to axes, daggers, and swords. It also made objects that had no practical purpose at all, except to announce that the person holding them had access to power. Decorated weapons, fine bowls, figurines, furniture fittings, gifts for kings. So bronze was not merely an industry. It was part of the operating system of the entire world. If you controlled bronze, you could equip workers, arm soldiers, reward loyal officials, and display wealth at court. If you did not control it, you were not instantly helpless. Stone, wood, bone, and simple copper were still available. People had used those materials for thousands of years. But you would be operating at a disadvantage in a world where your neighbours had bronze tools, bronze weapons, and bronze stored in palace magazines. Now here is the problem. Copper and tin did not occur together in convenient, evenly distributed deposits. Copper was relatively widespread compared with tin. It could be mined in Cyprus, in Anatolia, in the Levant, in Egypt's Sinai region, and in parts of the Aegean and farther west. Not every kingdom had equal supplies, of course. Some regions had rich ores. Others had little, but copper, at least, could be found in a number of places around the eastern Mediterranean. Tin was different. Tin was the difficult half of the recipe. Much rarer, much more unevenly distributed, and still, in some ways, frustratingly mysterious to historians. We know late Bronze Age societies used enormous amounts of it. We know it moved over long distances, but tracing every source is difficult because ancient trade was complicated. Metal was recycled constantly, and tin can pass through many hands before it reaches a workshop. Some tin likely came from sources in Anatolia and the Iranian plateau. Central Asia may have supplied part of the wider system. There are also possible links to regions far to the east, and perhaps through more indirect routes to areas in Europe. The exact balance is debated. What is not really in doubt is the larger point. The people making bronze in Egypt, Syria, the Aegean, Cyprus, and the Hittite world often depended on tin that came from beyond their own immediate horizons. Not necessarily from one distant mine, carried by one merchant all the way to one palace. Trade rarely worked that neatly. More likely, tin moved in stages, out of a mining district, into the hands of local traders, along caravan routes, through mountain passes into a Mesopotamian city or Anatolian market, then perhaps onward in measured quantities to a Levantine port, where it could be loaded onto a ship beside textiles, oil, glass, ivory, and copper. By the time a bronze worker on the coast of Syria received a small lump of tin, that metal may already have crossed deserts, borders, languages, and political systems. It may have been taxed by a ruler, protected by soldiers, recorded by a scribe, exchanged as a diplomatic gift, or redirected by a palace official who needed to equip troops before anyone else got a share. That is what it means to say bronze required a network. Copper by itself was valuable. Tin by itself was valuable. But their greatest value appeared only when they met in the right proportions, at the right time in the hands of someone with the knowledge and fuel to turn them into bronze. A disruption anywhere along that chain could leave a workshop with one ingredient and no way to complete the process. Imagine being a palace administrator. You have copper ingots stacked in storage. Heavy, standardized, useful-looking things, often shaped like ox hides, with handles at the corners so they could be carried. You can count them, weigh them, record them on a tablet. They represent wealth. But if the tin shipment does not arrive, that copper has become less useful than it should be. Not worthless, never worthless, but incomplete. It is like having grain but no water, timber but no tools, a ship but no sailcloth. The essential material is there, but the system that turns it into something useful has broken at one crucial point. And rulers could not simply fix this overnight. A modern government facing a shortage might try to buy supplies from another country, open a reserve, change a factory line, or fly an emergency cargo. A Bronze Age ruler had none of those options. He could send letters. He could dispatch envoys. He could offer gifts, make threats, promise favours, or order merchants to find new routes. But he could not manufacture a tin mine in his territory. He could not force a caravan through a mountain pass controlled by an enemy. He could not guarantee that a ship would survive pirates, storms, or war. Even if an alternative source existed, finding it took knowledge. Reaching it took time. Establishing trust took years. And moving heavy material across ancient landscapes was slow, expensive, and dangerous. A king who lost access to a supplier might have to ask, who else has tin? Who knows the route? Which ruler controls the road? What tribute will they demand? Will my rival hear about this and outbid me? Can I spare guards for the caravan? Can I spare silver to pay for the metal when I also need grain for the cities and wages for the soldiers? Suddenly, a missing shipment of tin is not a minor inconvenience. It is a diplomatic crisis, a military problem, a budget problem, a labour problem, and eventually, if it continues long enough, a political problem. Because people near the top of these societies expected bronze to keep moving. The king expected weapons for his troops. The troops expected equipment. Workshops expected raw materials. Farmers and craftsmen expected replacement tools. Elite families expected gifts and luxury objects that confirmed their rank. Temples expected offerings. Ships needed repairs. Chariots needed fittings. Every one of these needs drew from the same broad pool of metal. And this brings us to an important distinction. Not all trade was the same. There was trade in finished goods, beautiful cups, carved ivory, dyed textiles, perfumed oils, painted pottery, jewellery, furniture, weapons made by skilled specialists. These things mattered. They carried prestige. They could create friendships between courts, enrich merchants, and make an elite household look properly elite. A king might send another king a gold cup, a fine horse, or an exquisitely made sword, and the object would say something. It would say, I have wealth, I have craftsmen, I remember our relationship. But raw materials were different. A finished bronze sword could be admired, gifted, stored, or melted down and reused. But a cargo of copper and tin was more fundamental. It was potential. It was thousands of future objects not yet made. Tools, weapons, vessels, ornaments, payments, repairs. It fed the workshops that kept the rest of the economy functioning. Luxury trade made the system glitter. Raw material supply made it work. And the two were deeply connected. The same ships that carried copper ingots might also carry glass, ivory, spices, and fine pottery. The same ports that handled diplomatic gifts also stored bulk cargo. The same officials who welcomed foreign envoys might be counting metal by weight in palace warehouses. It could all look like one smooth flow of wealth across the sea. But underneath, some cargoes were far less optional than others. A palace could probably survive for a while without the newest fashionable cup from across the water. It could not keep operating forever without the metals that equipped its workers, armed its guards, and upheld its authority. Which meant that every bronze blade, every bronze sickle, every polished ceremonial bowl carried a hidden story inside it. A story of mines, roads, barges, caravans, warehouses, contracts, bribes, letters, storms, and people in distant places doing their jobs at the right moment. And when enough of those people could no longer do those jobs, bronze did not disappear all at once. But the network that made bronze possible began to lose its grip. Tin was the pressure point, not because it was used in larger quantities than copper. Quite the opposite. A bronze maker needed only a relatively small amount of tin compared with the copper in the furnace. But that small amount changed everything. Without it, the copper could not become the hard, reliable bronze that palaces, armies, farms, and workshops had come to depend on. And unlike copper, tin was difficult to find close at hand. The main ore of tin is cassiterite, a dark, heavy mineral that can occur in veins in the ground, or be washed into stream beds by erosion. In theory, people could collect it from river sediments, crush it, heat it, and extract the metal. In practice, they first had to know where it was, then they had to reach it. Then they had to move it across a world of mountains, deserts, rival kingdoms, unstable frontiers, and sometimes very long stretches of sea. A king in Egypt could look north across the Mediterranean and see Cyprus, or send expeditions towards Sinai and Nubia. Copper was available through several routes, but tin was another matter. It came from the edge of the known world, or at least from places far beyond the direct reach of the kingdoms using it. And even now, more than 3,000 years later, historians cannot draw one neat line on a map and say this was where all the tin came from. That uncertainty is important. For a long time, the search for Bronze Age tin sources had the feeling of a historical detective story. Archaeologists knew there had to be major supplies somewhere. The Eastern Mediterranean used bronze on a huge scale. Palaces recorded metal. Ships carried metal. Workshops turned it into thousands upon thousands of practical and prestigious objects. So where was the tin being mined? Possible answers lie in several directions. There were tin deposits in Anatolia, the great peninsula of modern Turkey, a land of high plateaus, mountain chains and routes leading towards Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. Some Anatolian sources were certainly known in antiquity. But whether they could have supplied all or even most of the late Bronze Age demand is much harder to establish. Then there was the Iranian plateau east of Mesopotamia. Beyond it lay Central Asia, including regions in and around modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. These areas contained significant mineral resources, and archaeological evidence shows that communities there were involved in mining and long-distance exchange from very early periods. From there, tin may have travelled west in stages, not one epic caravan setting out from a mine and marching all the way to a palace on the Mediterranean. More likely, the metal changed hands repeatedly. A mining community sold or delivered ore or raw tin to regional traders. Those traders moved it to a settlement on a larger route. Another merchant carried it through a mountain pass. A local ruler took a share. A city market redistributed it. A Mesopotamian merchant bundled it with wool, textiles, silver, or other goods. Eventually, perhaps months or years after it left its source, it reached Syria or Anatolia. From there, it could enter the maritime world. By the time it arrived at a workshop in Ugarit, Mycenaean Greece, or Egypt, nobody at the final destination necessarily knew the name of the streambed village or mountain where it had begun. They only knew that tin had arrived or that it had not. There are also arguments for sources farther away. Some scholars have considered links reaching toward the east, perhaps through networks that connected the Iranian plateau with regions farther into Central and South Asia. Others have looked west, toward Europe. Cornwall in Britain is famous for its later tin, and tin deposits existed in parts of Iberia and Central Europe as well. It is possible that some Western tin entered Mediterranean exchange networks, especially in certain periods. But the scale, timing, and precise routes remain debated. That word, debated, appears often in the study of Bronze Age tin. It is not because historians are guessing blindly. It is because the evidence is difficult by its nature. Tin moves, tin is melted, tin is mixed with copper. Bronze objects are recycled. A damaged sword becomes a chisel. A broken chisel becomes part of a new casting. A palace may collect old metal as tax, tribute, or emergency supply and melt it all down together. By the time archaeologists find a bronze object in the ground, the tin inside it may have had a long and complicated life. Modern scientific techniques have helped, especially chemical analysis and the study of isotopes. Isotopes are versions of an element with slightly different atomic weights, and particular ore deposits can sometimes have distinctive signatures. The hope is simple enough. Analyze the tin in an ancient object or ingot, compare it with known ores, and perhaps identify where it came from. Sometimes this produces tantalizing results. A group of tin ingots may seem chemically consistent with ores from one broad region rather than another. A cargo from a wreck may suggest connections that written records never mention. Scientific studies have strengthened the idea that Bronze Age supply networks were remarkably wide, reaching well beyond the eastern Mediterranean itself. But there are limits. Ancient ores from different regions can overlap in their signatures. Many potential mines have not been fully sampled. Some deposits used in the Bronze Age may now be exhausted, inaccessible, or simply unknown to modern researchers. Smelting and mixing can blur the original chemical signal, and an ingot found on a ship tells us where it was being carried from, not necessarily where it was mined. A merchant in a Levantine port might load tin acquired from an Anatolian middleman, who had received it from Mesopotamian traders, whose own suppliers came from somewhere much farther east. So scientific sourcing can narrow possibilities. It can challenge old assumptions. It can reveal that a simple story is probably wrong. What it cannot always do is give us a final answer. And perhaps that uncertainty tells us something real about the world itself. The late Bronze Age was not a system built around transparent supply chains. There were no labels saying tin from this mine, shipped by this company, delivered on this date. Knowledge was power. A merchant who knew a safe route through the mountains had something valuable. A palace official who knew which foreign ruler could be trusted had something valuable. A community that controlled a source, a pass, a harbour, or a caravan stop had something valuable. Tin did not merely travel through geography, it travelled through relationships. This made it strategically important in a way that is easy to underestimate. Copper was the bulk material. A ship could carry enormous copper ingots, each one heavy enough to require real labour to move. Tin was lighter, smaller in quantity, easier to store. But precisely because it was scarce, a relatively modest shipment could matter enormously. Picture a workshop with enough copper to make hundreds of tools. The furnace is ready. The charcoal has been gathered. Skilled workers are waiting. Moulds have been prepared. But the tin stores are low. The workshop does not necessarily stop that day. It may use old bronze. It may remelt damaged objects. It may stretch the available tin by making lower tin alloys. It may produce more objects in copper, or shift precious bronze toward weapons and elite needs. But each of those choices is a compromise, and compromises travel upward. If bronze is reserved for soldiers, farmers may wait longer for replacement sickles and axes. If tools are prioritized, the army may receive fewer new weapons. If the palace melts down old ceremonial objects, it is admitting that fresh supplies are uncertain. If a ruler gives the best metal to loyal guards and chariot forces, local officials and dependent communities may feel the shortage first. A bottleneck in one material could spread through many kingdoms because the kingdoms were buying from, borrowing from, competing with, and negotiating with one another. If a route through Anatolia became dangerous, merchants might seek alternatives through Syria or Mesopotamia that put pressure on those routes. If a distant mining district fell under new political control, prices could rise. If war interrupted caravan traffic, a port city might receive less tin. If a port city received less tin, its workshops produced less bronze. If its workshops produced less bronze, rulers had fewer gifts to send, fewer tools to redistribute, fewer weapons to issue, and fewer ways to reward the people whose loyalty held the system together. No single missing shipment had to destroy a civilization, but a repeated shortage across several years during war, drought, rebellion, or political crisis could make every other problem worse. That was the danger of tin. It was a small ingredient with an oversized role, a narrow bridge connecting mines no one could fully control to kingdoms that had built much of their strength on what came across that bridge. And somewhere along those routes, before the palaces burned and the cities fell silent, that bridge began to narrow. But tin was only one half of the bronze equation. The other half was copper. And if tin came from uncertain places beyond the horizon, copper had one great centre in the eastern Mediterranean, an island positioned almost perfectly between the major powers of the age. Cyprus. In late Bronze Age records, Cyprus was usually called Alashia. The name appears in letters exchanged between kings, in lists of tribute and gifts, in diplomatic messages sent across the sea. Most scholars identify Alashia with Cyprus, though the precise location of its political centre is still debated. What matters is that the rulers of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and the cities of the Levant all knew Alashia as a place of copper, a place that mattered. Cyprus lay in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, not far from the coast of Anatolia to the north, the Levant to the east, and Egypt to the south. To the west lay the routes toward the Aegean world and Mycenaean Greece. It was an island, but not an isolated one. It sat in the middle of several worlds at once. That position made Cyprus wealthy. Its mountains contained copper ores, especially deposits associated with a green-blue mineral called copper sulfide ore. Ancient miners cut into the landscape, collected the ore, and carried it to furnaces. There, using charcoal and tremendous heat, they separated usable copper from the rock around it. It was exhausting work. Mining was dangerous. Smelting consumed wood in enormous quantities. Every stage required labour, skill, fuel, organisation, and access to water and transport. But when it worked, the result was metal, and metal could become almost anything a Bronze Age kingdom needed. Axes, chisels, sickles, knives, spearheads, swords, arrowheads, bowls, mirrors, tools for carpenters and masons, fittings for chariots, objects for temples, gifts for kings, wealth that could be stored, counted, melted down, and made into something new. Cyprus did not have to make every finished object itself. In many cases, its greatest importance may have been as a supplier of raw copper to workshops elsewhere. The island turned ore into transportable metal, then sent that metal outward through the trade networks of the eastern Mediterranean. The usual form was one of the most recognizable objects from the Bronze Age world, the ox-hide ingot, Despite the name, it was not made from animal skin. It was a large slab of copper, often weighing around 20 to 30 kilograms, shaped with 4 projecting corners. To modern eyes, the shape resembles the hide of an animal stretched flat, with its legs extended. But the form was practical as well as distinctive. Those projections could be used as handles. A worker could lift the ingot, lash it to a pack animal, secure it in a ship's cargo hold, or carry it with the help of another person. It was metal designed to move, and that shape appears across a remarkable area. Oxheady ingots have been found on Cyprus itself, along the Levantine coast, in Egypt, on Crete, in mainland Greece, and as far west as Sardinia. They appear in shipwrecks and in settlements, in places connected by sea lanes that crossed political borders and linguistic boundaries. A copper ingot from Cyprus could begin in mountain ore. It might pass through a smelting site, then to a coastal storehouse. From there, it could be loaded onto a merchant ship with jars of oil, timber, pottery, glass, ivory, or luxury goods. It might stop at a Levantine harbour, be exchanged through merchants or palace officials, then continue to Egypt or the Aegean. At every stage, someone took a share. This is what standardized exchange looks like before coins, before banks, before corporations, before written invoices that survive in neat archives. The ingot itself carried part of the system within its shape. It was recognizable, it was movable, it could be counted. A palace official did not need to assay every lump of metal from scratch if he received a cargo in familiar expected units. 1 ingot, 10 ingots, 100 ingots. The famous Uluburun shipwreck, which sank off the coast of Anatolia around the late 14th century BCE, carried roughly 10 tons of copper in oxhide ingots, along with about a ton of tin. That cargo was enough to produce an enormous quantity of bronze. Not merely jewellery for a few elites, but potentially tools and weapons on a scale that connected mines, ships, workshops, soldiers, farmers, and royal storehouses. It gives us a glimpse of the system at its most impressive, but also at its most fragile, because Cyprus was rich precisely because its copper could leave the island. A mountain mine was valuable only if ore could be extracted. Smelters were valuable only if they had fuel and workers. Copper ingots were valuable only if they could reach ports. Ports were valuable only if ships could approach safely. And ships were valuable only if the sea lanes remained open enough for merchants to risk their cargoes. An island can be a bridge. It can also become a trap. Imagine a period of insecurity, not necessarily one dramatic invasion. It could begin more quietly than that. Pirates, raiders, or enemy ships make coastal travel dangerous. A war on the Anatolian mainland disrupts trade routes. A local ruler loses control of a harbour, workers flee a mining district. Forests near smelting sites are overused, making charcoal harder to obtain. A drought reduces food supplies, and miners or furnace workers have to abandon their jobs to feed their families. None of these problems has to end copper production completely. That is important. Ancient economies rarely stop all at once. They bend, they reroute, they use stored supplies. They recycle old metal, they shift production to safer places. A ruler may send guards to a mine, fortify a harbour, or demand that merchants sail in groups. A workshop may melt broken tools and old weapons to keep its furnaces working, but each adjustment costs something. If copper from Cyprus arrives less often, bronze production becomes harder, even if tin is available. If tin is scarce at the same time, the problem becomes much worse. A palace that once expected shiploads of standardized copper may now receive smaller deliveries, late deliveries, or none at all. Its ability to equip workers, reward allies, repair chariots, arm soldiers, and send gifts abroad begins to weaken. and weakening could spread through the entire network. Egypt needed copper. The cities of the Levant needed copper. Mycenaean palaces needed copper. Anatolian kingdoms needed copper. They had other sources, certainly, and Cyprus was not the only place where copper existed. But Al-Ashir was large, visible, strategically placed, and deeply connected. When its output moved smoothly, it helped keep the eastern Mediterranean moving smoothly. When that movement became uncertain, everyone noticed. The wealth of Cyprus was never just in its mines. It was in the confidence that a cargo would be loaded, a ship would sail, a harbour would receive it, and a palace could turn raw metal into power. And that brings us closer to the heart of the Late Bronze Age system. Because palaces were not simply places where kings lived. They were machines for collecting resources, controlling their movement, and giving them back out again. A palace was a machine, not a machine made of gears and iron, of course. A machine made of people, storehouses, scribes, carts, fields, animals, workshops, and orders moving outward from a ruler's household. At the centre was the king or queen or royal family. Around them stood administrators, priests, military commanders, messengers and scribes. Beyond them were farmers, shepherds, weavers, miners, metalworkers, potters, shipbuilders, drivers, labourers and soldiers. The palace did not necessarily own every field or control every exchange, but it tried to pull a large share of the kingdom's useful things toward itself. Grain, livestock, wool, linen, olive oil, wine, timber, copper, tin, finished cloth, weapons, labour. Then it sent those resources back out again. This was the basic rhythm of many late Bronze Age states. Collection and redistribution. Take in, record, store, assign, deliver. Again and again, season after season. A farming village might owe part of its harvest to a temple, a local official, or the palace itself. Herding communities could deliver sheep, goats, cattle, hides or wool. Landholders might be required to provide workers at harvest time, men for military service, animals for transport or labour for roads, walls, canals and royal building projects. The palace took these contributions in many forms because money, in the modern sense, was not the main tool holding the economy together. Silver could be weighed out in some places. Barter and private deals certainly existed, but much of the great institutional economy ran on goods and obligations. A village did not always pay its ruler with coins. It paid with sacks of grain, with jars of oil, with sheep counted by the head, with days of work, with sons sent to serve in an army, with daughters assigned to textile workshops, with timber hauled down from the hills. And the palace needed all of it. Grain-fed officials, guards, craftsmen and workers who could not spend every day growing food for themselves. Wool became thread, then cloth, then garments that could be used by the royal household, issued to dependents, offered to temples, or sent abroad as diplomatic gifts. Metals became tools, weapons, vessels, and prestige objects. Livestock supplied meat, leather, milk, wool, traction, and sacrifice. The system was not just about wealth, it was about control over time. Grain harvested in autumn could sustain people through winter. Wool sheared in one season could be woven into cloth months later. Copper received from overseas could sit in storage until a workshop needed it. By gathering resources into central storehouses, a palace could move them from one place to another, and from one moment to another. That gave rulers enormous power. In Egypt, surviving texts, tomb scenes, administrative records, and archaeological evidence show a state deeply concerned with agricultural output, labour obligations, storehouses, and the movement of supplies. The Nile's annual flood made grain production unusually productive when conditions were good. Officials could assess land, organise work, and collect deliveries. Large institutions, including royal estates and temples, stored grain on a scale far beyond a single household. A granary was not just a building full of food, it was security. It was wages. It was famine relief, at least for those the institution chose to protect. It was the ability to feed workers building monuments, soldiers guarding frontiers, sailors travelling on royal business, and administrators who spent their lives counting what everyone else produced. The Hittite Empire, centred in Anatolia, left a different but equally revealing paper trail. Or rather, a clay trail. Hittite scribes pressed records into tablets, treaties, laws, royal instructions, land grants, religious texts and letters. These documents reveal a kingdom held together by duties flowing between the centre and its provinces. Local rulers and officials owed loyalty, troops, supplies, and obedience. The king, in return, confirmed authority, distributed land, demanded justice, and intervened when the system broke down. An empire that stretched across mountains and difficult roads could not survive on royal charisma alone. It needed information. Who owed grain? Which district could provide horses? Which governor had failed to send troops? Which frontier town needed supplies before winter? The answer had to travel, often on a tablet carried by a messenger. Then there are the linear B tablets from Mycenaean Greece. These are among the clearest windows into the palace economy because they are so practical, so almost painfully ordinary. They record flocks of sheep, measures of grain, jars of oil, lists of women working in textile production, bronze assigned to smiths, chariot wheels, land holdings, taxes or obligations, personnel counted and categorized with the careful attention of people who knew that a missing shipment could become a serious problem. The tablets do not read like epic poetry. They read like a warehouse trying not to lose track of its inventory. And that is exactly what makes them so valuable. At Pylos, Knossos, Thebes, and other palace centres, scribes used Linear B to help administer a world of specialised labour. A bronze worker needed raw metal, a weaver needed wool, a perfumer needed oil and aromatic ingredients, a chariot maker needed wood, leather, metal fittings, and skilled assistants. A palace could bring these materials together in ways that an isolated household could not. But specialists also became dependent. A weaver attached to a palace workshop may have received rations of grain, perhaps oil or cloth, in exchange for labour. A smith might receive a measured amount of bronze and be expected to turn it into tools or weapons. Workers could be organised in groups, supervised by officials, and assigned quotas. Their survival was tied, at least partly, to the regular arrival of food and raw materials from institutions above them. This arrangement was efficient when everything was working. A palace could concentrate hundreds of workers on a task. It could equip armies. It could feed crews. It could store grain after a good harvest and distribute it during a poor one. It could take copper from Cyprus, tin from distant routes, and skilled labour from its own territories, then turn them into bronze weapons for soldiers or gifts for foreign kings. Centralisation made large projects possible: walls, fortresses, ships, chariots, temples, administrative buildings, long-distance diplomacy. The entire glittering surface of late Bronze Age power depended on institutions capable of gathering resources on a scale that villages alone could never manage. But there was another economy too. Ordinary people bought, sold, bartered, borrowed, gave gifts, hired help, exchanged livestock, and dealt with neighbours. Local markets likely operated in many towns and villages, even if they are harder to see in the surviving records. Farmers did not wait for palace instructions before trading a pot of oil for a tool or cloth for food or labour for help at harvest. The palace economy was not the whole economy. It was the high-pressure system sitting above many smaller systems. And because palaces produced most of the writing that survives, their own records can make them seem more all-powerful than they really were. They tell us what officials wanted to count, not necessarily everything that happened beyond their view. Still, the palace mattered because it connected distant needs. A local market could help a family replace a broken sickle. It could not easily bring a shipload of Cypriot copper into an inland workshop, organize thousands of soldiers, or send grain across a kingdom during a crisis. That was the strength of the palace, and its hidden weakness. The more people depended on central collection and redistribution, the more damage could be done when the centre failed. If harvests fell, storehouses emptied. If roads became unsafe, deliveries stopped. If ships did not arrive, workshops lacked metal. If a palace could not issue rations, workers might leave, revolt, or simply return to finding food wherever they could. A system built to move resources efficiently could become dangerously brittle when movement slowed, and the late Bronze Age world had built its power on movement. Not only of copper and tin, but of grain, wool, labour, information, and trust. The palace stood at the centre, counting it all, but beyond the walls another kind of exchange was taking place between kings themselves. They called it gift-giving. It was never just a gift. A king did not send another king a gift because he had seen something lovely and thought, "This will cheer him up." He sent gold because gold meant Egypt had access to the Nile's wealth, Nubian mines, temple treasuries, and the labour needed to bring precious metal from the ground into royal hands. He sent silver because silver was scarce in some places and valuable almost everywhere. He sent ivory because ivory came through long and difficult routes from Africa and beyond. He sent dyed textiles, carved boxes, inlaid furniture, decorated weapons, fine vessels, exotic animals, perfumes, lapis lazuli, and horses, because these things carried a message. The message was simple. I am rich enough to give this away. And more importantly, I am powerful enough that you should want to remain my friend. In the late Bronze Age, royal gift exchange was diplomacy made physical. It was politics packed into crates, loaded onto donkeys, ships and wagons, then carried across mountains, deserts and seas by messengers who had to arrive alive. We can see this world especially clearly in the Amarna letters, a remarkable archive of clay tablets found in Egypt. Most date to the reigns of the pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten in the 14th century BC. They preserve correspondence between Egypt and rulers in Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, Al-Ashir, probably Cyprus and the Hittite world, along with letters from smaller rulers in the Levant. The tablets are formal, repetitive, sometimes flattering, sometimes almost painfully annoyed. Again and again kings call one another brother. To the king, my brother, thus speaks the king, your brother. It sounds warm, almost affectionate, but brotherhood was not casual language. It was a diplomatic category. Great kings, rulers of major states, addressed one another as equals. Egypt's pharaoh was brother to the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon was brother to the king of Mitanni. They exchanged greetings, gifts, marriages, complaints, and carefully measured declarations of friendship. But not everyone was a brother. The rulers of smaller city-states, especially in Canaan and Syria, often addressed the pharaoh very differently. They called themselves servants. They called Egypt's king their lord, sometimes their son. They bowed, metaphorically at least, at his feet. Their letters were full of reassurance, requests for troops, reports of enemies, and anxious reminders that they remained loyal. Language told everyone where they stood. A gift did the same thing. When equals exchanged luxury goods, the exchange was supposed to be balanced. though balance did not necessarily mean identical value. A Babylonian king might send lapis lazuli, fine horses, or crafted objects. Egypt might send gold. A king of Mitanni could offer horses, chariots, trained specialists, or a royal bride. The goods were useful. Certainly horses could pull chariots. Gold could be remade into jewellery, cups, or diplomatic payments. Textiles could clothe a court or be passed on to allies. But their real value was larger than their material. They were proof that a relationship was active. A foreign embassy arriving at a palace was evidence that roads were open, ships were sailing, messengers were being protected, and rulers still believed agreements were worth honouring. When the gifts arrived, the receiving king could display them before his court. He could give them onward to officials, relatives, generals, temple institutions, and dependent rulers. A gold cup from Egypt might eventually become a treasure in another palace. A Mycenaean vessel might travel east. Ivory could be carved again in a Levantine workshop. Cloth woven in one kingdom could be worn at a ceremony in another. The object moved, but so did the prestige attached to it. This was not simple trade. Trade usually asks, "What is this worth?" Diplomatic gift exchange asked, "What does this relationship require?" And the answer could be complicated. A king who received gifts was expected to respond. Not necessarily immediately, not necessarily with the same objects. But he had to acknowledge the relationship. He had to show generosity appropriate to his rank. If he sent too little, or if the quality was poor, the insult could be remembered. The Amarna letters preserve some wonderfully human complaints about this. Foreign kings asked Egypt for gold, sometimes with extraordinary confidence. Egypt, they had heard, had gold in quantities beyond counting. Gold was said to be as common as dust. Send much gold, they requested, because a temple needed building, because a palace project required it, because friendship should be generous. And then sometimes came the disappointment. The gold was late. The gold was insufficient. The gold seemed impure. One Babylonian king complained that gifts sent by Egypt did not match the scale of friendship he expected. Another ruler sent envoys and worried that they had been treated poorly. Behind the polished formulas, these letters reveal sovereigns keeping score. Friendship had an account book. A gift that failed to arrive could be more than an inconvenience. It could suggest neglect, weakness, disrespect, or a change in political priorities. If Egypt could no longer send gold, was Egypt less wealthy than it claimed? If a distant king stopped sending horses or lapis, had he found another ally? If messengers were delayed or harmed, could the roads still be trusted? These questions mattered because diplomacy and commerce overlapped constantly. The same routes that carried royal gifts also carried merchants, raw materials, tributes, soldiers, craftsmen, and information. A diplomatic mission might include gifts for a king, but it could also negotiate access to goods, settle disputes, arrange transport, and establish the goodwill that made merchants safer abroad. Political trust made trade easier. Trade, in turn, gave rulers reasons to preserve political trust. And then there were marriage alliances, perhaps the most valuable gifts of all. Royal daughters crossed borders to marry foreign kings. A princess from Mitanni was sent to Egypt. Babylonian princesses entered foreign courts. These women did not travel alone. They came with servants, attendants, textiles, jewellery, dowries, religious practices, languages, and personal connections to the court they had left behind. A royal marriage tied two palaces together through family, at least in theory. A king who married another king's daughter was not simply gaining a wife. He was gaining an obligation. Her father expected respect, gifts, influence, and security for his daughter. Her relatives could become advocates for an alliance. Her attendants might carry news across borders. Her children could embody claims, loyalties, and future diplomatic possibilities. But marriages also revealed hierarchy. Foreign kings repeatedly asked for Egyptian princesses. Egypt accepted foreign royal women into the pharaoh's household, but appears rarely, if ever, to have sent an Egyptian princess abroad. This was not a minor detail. It was Egypt quietly insisting that its status was different. Other great kings could be brothers, but the pharaoh's daughters did not leave Egypt to become someone else's queens. Even intimacy had a ranking system. So when ships later crossed the eastern Mediterranean carrying gold, silver, ivory, glass, textiles, weapons, horses, and carefully made luxury goods, they were carrying more than expensive cargo. They were carrying promises. Promises that kings remained friendly. Promises that envoys could travel safely. Promises that a marriage alliance still mattered. Promises that one palace would answer another palace's request when the time came. And like all promises, they only held their value while people believed they would be kept. The late Bronze Age world was rich in beautiful things. But the beauty was never the whole point. A carved ivory box could be a diplomatic statement. A shipment of gold could be a test of loyalty. A princess crossing the sea could bind two kingdoms together, or expose the distance between them. The system looked glittering from the outside. But beneath the gold and ivory, it rested on something far more fragile. Trust moving from one shore to another. Trust moving from one shore to another. But shores are separated by water, and water is never just empty space. For the kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, the eastern Mediterranean was a road, a difficult road, a seasonal road, a road with no milestones and no guards posted at every bend. But it was still the fastest way to move heavy cargo over long distances. A ship could carry goods that would be painfully slow, expensive, or nearly impossible to move by land. Copper ingots from Cyprus, jars of oil and wine from the Levant, timber from the mountains, Egyptian gold, Canaanite pottery, glass, ivory, incense, dyed cloth, finished weapons, and the personal possessions of merchants, messengers, sailors, craftsmen, and royal envoys. The sea made the network possible, but it did not make it easy. Mediterranean sailing was governed by weather, wind, seasons, and fear. Ancient ships did not simply leave one port, point their bows toward a distant destination, and cross open water whenever a king gave the order. Most preferred to travel during the safer months, roughly from spring through early autumn, when weather was more predictable and the worst winter storms were less likely to trap or destroy them. Winter did not make sailing impossible in every case. Local fishermen and desperate crews could still go out. But long-distance voyages became dangerous enough that merchants, palace officials and captains had reasons to wait. And waiting mattered. A delayed ship did not just mean someone received their luxury gift late. It could mean a workshop lacked copper. A palace could not distribute supplies. A merchant could not repay a debt. An official sent to collect taxes or deliver messages might remain stranded on the wrong side of the sea. One bad season could create shortages. Several bad seasons mixed with war or political instability could begin to break the rhythm of an entire economy. The ships themselves were products of careful knowledge. They were built from timber cut, shaped, joined, sealed, and maintained by skilled labour. Their crews needed sailors who understood winds, currents, landmarks, reefs, anchors, sails, and the changing colour of the water near a dangerous shore. They navigated mostly by following coasts, recognising headlands, islands, mountain ranges, and familiar harbours. At night, experienced mariners could use stars, but even with skill, the sea remained unpredictable. A sudden storm could turn cargo into a death sentence. Heavy goods were valuable, but they were also dangerous. Copper ingots, stone anchors, jars full of oil or wine, and large storage containers could shift in rough water. A hull could crack, a sail could tear, a crew could lose its bearings. And if a ship went down far from shore, there was no rescue service coming over the horizon. There was only the sea. That is one reason maritime trade usually did not follow a simple line from producer to consumer. Copper mined in Cyprus might be loaded at one harbour, then carried to a Levantine port. There it could be joined by goods from inland Syria or Mesopotamia, transferred to another vessel, exchanged for oil, grain, textiles or silver, and sent onward toward Egypt, Anatolia or the Aegean. A merchant rarely needed to control every stage. Cargo could change hands repeatedly. A ship might be hired for one leg of a journey, then unloaded and reloaded onto another. This was transshipment, and it made the sea lanes flexible. It also made them complicated. A port was not just a place where a ship stopped. It was a meeting point between worlds. Farmers and herders brought goods down from the interior. Caravan traders arrived with materials from far beyond the coast. Palace officials checked cargoes, demanded dues, recorded deliveries, and protected royal interests. Dock workers hauled jars and ingots. Craftsmen repaired hulls. Merchants negotiated prices. Sailors searched for water, food, rope, timber, and news. And news was cargo too. A captain arriving from Cyprus might know whether copper was moving normally. A merchant from Ugarit might hear that roads inland were unsafe. An Egyptian envoy could learn that a rival king was buying horses, gathering troops, or complaining about late shipments. In a world without newspapers or telegraphs, ports were information networks. Rumours landed there almost as often as cargo. The geography of the eastern Mediterranean encouraged this pattern of movement. The coastline of the Levant offered a chain of stopping places. Cyprus stood offshore as a great source of copper and a natural waypoint between Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. The islands of the Aegean formed stepping stones toward mainland Greece and western Anatolia. Crete, Rhodes, the Cyclades, and smaller islands gave sailors places to shelter, trade, refill water supplies, or wait for better weather. But a harbour was only useful if it was safe. Some ports had natural protection, bays, inlets, headlands, islands just offshore. Others needed walls, quays, warehouses, and officials capable of organising labour. A good harbour could make a small city rich. It could collect taxes from ships, store goods, attract craftsmen, and connect a ruler to distant markets. It could also become a target. Piracy was a constant possibility, though the line between pirate, raider, mercenary, and state-sponsored attacker was not always clear. A fast vessel or a small armed group could wait near a coast, seize cargo, capture sailors, or attack an isolated settlement. In periods of political stability, strong states and local rulers might patrol coasts, punish raiders, or make agreements that protected merchants. In periods of weakness, the same waters became much more dangerous. Control of the coast meant control of wealth. A ruler who held a harbour could regulate access to imports. A kingdom that controlled a narrow passage or island route could watch ships moving through it. A city that lost its coastline, or lost the ability to protect its ships, could find itself cut off from the very system that had made it prosperous. And there was another problem. The sea lanes depended on countless small acts of cooperation. Someone had to provide timber. Someone had to build the ship. Someone had to crew it. Someone had to supply food and water. Someone had to guarantee that the captain could enter a foreign harbour without being arrested, robbed, or treated as an enemy. Someone had to arrange payment when the cargo arrived. The Mediterranean network was not one road. It was thousands of relationships moving over water that made it powerful. A disruption in one place could sometimes be bypassed. Another harbour could receive the cargo. Another merchant could take over. Another route might open. But it also made the system vulnerable. If storms sank ships, if pirates multiplied, if coastal towns rebelled, if kings went to war, if harbours became unsafe, then the connective tissue began to tear. Goods stopped moving smoothly. Messages arrived late, or not at all. Palaces that depended on distant resources discovered that distance was not an abstract problem. It was a physical thing. It was wind against a sail. A damaged hull, a closed harbour, a missing ship. And sometimes, far below the surface, the evidence of that fragile world waited silently on the seabed. And sometimes, far below the surface, the evidence of that fragile world waited silently on the seabed. In the early 1980s, a sponge diver off the southern coast of Turkey saw something strange beneath the water near a place called Uluburun. At first it looked like a field of dark, regular shapes scattered across the slope. But they were not rocks. They were copper ingots, hundreds of them. The ship that had carried them had sunk sometime in the late 14th century BCE, perhaps around 1320 BCE, more than a century before the great political collapse began. Its wooden hull had mostly vanished. The sea had eaten the organic materials, broken the vessel apart, and spread its contents down a steep underwater hillside. But the cargo remained, and what a cargo it was. The Uluburun wreck is not a complete picture of every ship, every trader, or every route in the late Bronze Age. One wreck is one moment, one voyage, one crew with its own destination, its own contracts, its own mixture of official business and private trade. Archaeologists have to be careful. It would be easy to look at this one sunken vessel and imagine that every ship carried exactly the same things. They did not. But Uluburun gives us something rare. It gives us a physical pile of evidence. Not a king's boast carved in stone. Not a damaged tablet listing goods that may or may not have arrived. An actual shipload lying where it fell, carrying materials from different corners of the known world. At the centre of it all was metal. The wreck contained roughly 10 tons of copper, much of it cast into distinctive oxhide ingots. These were broad, flat slabs with 4 projecting corners, shaped a little like an animal skin stretched out to dry. The shape made them easier to grip, lift, and stack. Most appear to have come from Cyprus, the great copper island sitting between Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. 10 tons. Try to imagine it. Not 10 pounds of precious metal in a merchant's chest. Not a few ceremonial objects for a king. 10 tons of copper moving across the sea in a single wooden ship. And copper was only half the equation. The cargo also included about a ton of tin. Tin was rarer, harder to obtain, and far more mysterious in its roots. Copper could be turned into useful tools by itself. But mix it with tin in the right proportions, and you made bronze. Stronger than copper, harder, better for weapons, tools, armour, fittings, vessels, and the 1,000 practical objects that kept palace societies functioning. This was enough metal, at least in theory, to make many thousands of bronze objects. A ship carrying that much copper and tin was not simply transporting wealth. It was carrying future swords, future spearheads, future axes, future chisels, pins, sickles, hinges, bowls, and royal gifts. It was carrying the raw material of military power and administrative power. The metal had not yet become objects, but everyone involved understood what it could become. And then there was glass. The Uluburun ship carried raw glass ingots in bright colours, deep cobalt blue, turquoise, and a purple-blue shade, sometimes called lavender. Glass at this time was difficult to produce. It required specialized knowledge, high temperatures, controlled materials, and skilled craftspeople. These ingots were not finished cups or beads. They were the ingredients for workshops elsewhere, perhaps in the Levant, Egypt, the Aegean, or beyond. So the ship was carrying materials for materials, copper to become bronze, glass to become beads, inlays, jewellery, and luxury vessels. Raw substances moving toward artisans who would transform them into finished objects, which could then move again through palaces, temples, markets, and gift exchanges. The cargo also included ivory, probably from elephants and hippopotamuses, along with ebony from Africa, aromatic resins stored in Canaanite jars, and luxury goods from far-flung places. There were gold objects, jewellery, faience items, stone tools, balance weights, weapons, and personal possessions. Egyptian objects appeared beside Levantine pottery. Materials associated with the Aegean appeared beside goods linked to Cyprus, the Levant, Africa, and perhaps regions much farther east. A tiny gold scarab bore the name of Nefertiti, the Egyptian queen of the Amarna period. That does not mean Nefertiti herself had touched it. It does not prove the ship sailed directly from Egypt, or that it belonged to an Egyptian royal mission. Objects can travel long after they are made. They can be traded, inherited, gifted, stolen, or carried by someone who simply liked them. But that is the point. The ship was not carrying one kingdom's cargo. It was carrying a network. Picture the chain behind a single piece of ivory. An animal killed or found in Africa, the tusk transported north, passed through traders, officials, or caravan routes, loaded onto a ship in a Levantine harbour, sent toward a workshop where an artisan would carve it into furniture inlays, combs, boxes, game pieces, or ceremonial objects. Now picture a tin ingot, mined somewhere distant, perhaps in Central Asia, Anatolia, or another source still debated by scholars, moved by caravan across mountains and plains, exchanged in a city where nobody had seen the original mine, loaded beside Cypriot copper, carried over dangerous water toward a place where bronze workers waited. The late Bronze Age did not run on isolated kingdoms making everything they needed. It ran on movement. Uluburun makes that reality almost uncomfortably clear. A single ship could hold goods whose histories stretched across continents. It depended on miners, herders, woodcutters, sailors, potters, merchants, guards, scribes, port officials, craftsmen, and rulers. It depended on roads being open, harbours being safe, debts being honoured, and strangers being willing to exchange valuable things without immediately trying to kill each other. And this ship sank. Maybe a storm drove it onto the rocks. Maybe the crew lost control near the coast. We cannot know exactly what happened in its final hours. The sea kept that part of the story, but its cargo shows what was at stake whenever a ship failed to arrive. Not just treasure, not just luxury, an entire chain of expectations waiting on the far shore. The people waiting on the far shore sometimes left records. And at Ugarit they left a great many. Ugarit stood on the coast of northern Syria, near modern Ras Shamra, looking out across the eastern Mediterranean. It was not the largest kingdom of its age. It did not command an empire like Egypt or Hatti, but it occupied a position that made it enormously valuable. Behind it lay the roots of inland Syria and Mesopotamia. Before it lay the sea, Cyprus, Anatolia, the Aegean, Egypt, and every ship moving between them. Its harbour, probably centred at nearby Minet el-Baida, was where these worlds met. Merchants arrived with copper, timber, oil, wine, pottery, textiles, ivory, and luxury goods. Officials measured cargoes. Sailors negotiated fees. Palace agents collected tribute and arranged shipments. Scribes recorded it all on clay tablets, and those tablets survived. When archaeologists uncovered Ugarit in the 20th century, they found archives in palaces, temples, and private houses. Thousands of tablets. Some were written in Ugaritic, the local language, using one of the earliest known alphabetic writing systems. Others were in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age. There were letters, contracts, inventories, lists of offerings, legal disputes, school exercises, myths, poems, and administrative records. Ugarit was cosmopolitan in the most practical sense. Its scribes could operate in several languages. Its rulers dealt with foreign kings. Its workshops used imported materials. Its prosperity depended on people, goods, and information continuing to move, which makes its final letters so haunting. In some of the tablets dating near the end of the city's life, the ordinary rhythms of administration begin to sound strained. There are messages about grain shipments, questions about vessels, instructions involving troops, reports of enemy movements, appeals for assistance from rulers who seem to have been watching the horizon and wondering whether help would arrive in time. One famous letter, sent by the king of Ugarit, Amurapi, to the ruler of Alashia, probably Cyprus, describes a terrifying situation. Enemy ships had appeared. Cities had been burned. The king says his own ships were away, apparently occupied elsewhere, while troops had been sent inland under Hittite obligations. His country, he says, had been abandoned to itself. It is one of those documents that feels almost too immediate to be ancient. A king on the Syrian coast writing to an island ruler. The enemy ships are here. My forces are elsewhere. Send help. But this is where caution matters. These tablets are not a diary with neat dates marking the exact final week of Ugarit. The destruction layers are real. The city was burned and never restored as the same Bronze Age kingdom. Yet scholars still debate the precise sequence of events, the dating of individual letters, and whether every alarming message belongs to the final assault itself. A warning may have been written months earlier. A shipment delayed by one crisis may not have been delayed by the crisis that finally destroyed the city. Still taken together, the records reveal something important. Ugarit had begun to feel the system failing. This was a port city built on connections, and connections could become vulnerabilities. A ship was not merely a wooden vessel arriving with useful cargo. It was a delivery of metal for workshops, food for households, timber for repairs, messages from allies, and proof that the routes remained open. When ships stopped arriving, nobody needed to announce that the world had changed. The empty harbour announced it. Ugarit also depended on protection. It could not provide entirely for itself. For much of its later history, the kingdom was a vassal of the Hittite Empire. That arrangement brought burdens. Ugarit owed taxes, ships, labour, diplomatic obedience, and sometimes military support. But it also brought security, at least in theory. The great Hittite kings controlled much of Anatolia and northern Syria. Their officials could intervene in disputes. Their armies, in better times, made neighbouring rulers think twice before attacking. That security was part of the trade network too. A merchant did not need to know every king personally. He only needed to believe that the roads were guarded, contracts could be enforced, and piracy or raiding would bring consequences. The power of Hatti, the wealth of Egypt, the copper of Cyprus, the ships of Levantine ports, all of it helped make trade feel predictable enough to continue. But by the early 12th century BCE, predictability was disappearing. The Hittite heartland was facing its own emergencies. Egypt was under pressure. Cities along the coast were vulnerable. Ships could become raiders, refugee transports, military vessels, or all three at once. Grain was becoming difficult to obtain in some regions. Local rulers were still writing letters, still requesting deliveries, still expecting the machinery of diplomacy to work. But the machinery was breaking while they were using it. Then Ugarit was destroyed. The archaeological evidence points to a violent end, probably around the transition from the 13th to the 12th century BCE, though the exact date remains debated. Fire swept through parts of the city. Buildings collapsed. Tablets were baked hard in the heat, preserving the words of people who had expected, as people usually do, that tomorrow's records would matter too. They did not leave because trade had become slightly less profitable. They disappeared because a trading node had ceased to function. And when a place like Ugarit went dark, the loss spread far beyond its walls. Ships lost a harbour. Inland producers lost an outlet. Foreign courts lost information. Workshops lost supplies. Rulers lost taxes, gifts, and allies. Every route that passed through the city had to find another path, if another path still existed. This is what collapse looked like before it became a legend. Not one giant switch being turned off. A harbour waiting for ships that no longer came. And the cargo that mattered most was often not copper, tin, ivory, or gold. It was grain. A city can survive for a while without a new necklace of amber. A palace can postpone an order for luxury cloth. A bronze workshop can slow down when metal is scarce. But people have to eat every day. The late Bronze Age world was full of places that could not feed themselves reliably from the land immediately around them. Coastal cities had limited farmland. Palace centres gathered large populations of administrators, craft workers, guards, labourers, priests, servants, and dependents. Garrisons sat in strategically important places, sometimes far from the fields that could support them. Armies on campaign consumed food at an astonishing rate. Fleets required crews, dockworkers, shipbuilders, and the networks that supplied all of them. Grain was not just food. It was wages. It was taxation. It was military power stored in jars. A palace collected grain from farmers, villages, estates, and conquered territories. It stored the harvest in magazines and granaries. Then it redistributed it. Rations to workers, provisions to soldiers, seed for planting, payments to officials, offerings to temples, emergency relief when local crops failed. This system could make a kingdom powerful. It could also make it frighteningly vulnerable. Because the palace economy worked best when grain kept flowing inward. A poor harvest in one district might be manageable. Grain could be moved from a better supplied region. Reserves could be opened. A ruler could request help from an ally. Ships could carry cargo across the sea more efficiently than carts could move it over land. But if several regions had trouble at once, the whole arrangement changed. Suddenly, every kingdom needed grain, and nobody wanted to export it. The letters from the final decades of the Late Bronze Age preserve glimpses of this pressure. They do not give us a complete account of a single Mediterranean-wide famine. Ancient records almost never make things that easy. But they do show rulers and officials urgently concerned with food deliveries, shipments, shortages, and the movement of grain between kingdoms. In one famous group of correspondence, the Hittite king requests grain from Egypt. Egyptian shipments were apparently sent toward the Hittite sphere, perhaps to relieve serious shortages in Anatolia or northern Syria. Later Egyptian inscriptions also refer to providing grain to Hatti, describing it as aid for a land in distress. The wording is political, of course. Kings did not write humble grocery lists. A grain shipment was diplomacy. It could be a gift from a great king to another great king, a payment, an obligation, or a carefully staged display of generosity. But beneath the royal language is a simple fact. Someone needed food badly enough to move it across the eastern Mediterranean. Other letters from Syria and the Levant mention grain in ways that sound less ceremonial and more urgent. Requests are made, deliveries are counted, officials are told to release supplies. Shipments are expected from places that may already have been under strain themselves. In a world where clay tablets were used for everything from international diplomacy to warehouse accounting, grain appears again and again because grain was the material basis beneath all the grander things. Gold could impress a foreign court. Grain could keep that court alive until spring. And this may be why the disruption of shipping was so dangerous. If a ship carrying luxury goods failed to arrive, a palace lost prestige and income. If a ship carrying grain failed to arrive, people went hungry. Workers could not be fed. Soldiers could not march. Sailors could not be provisioned. The same harbours that brought copper from Cyprus and fine pottery from the Aegean also connected hungry populations to distant harvests. When those sea lanes became uncertain, hunger could travel faster than an army. Now, was drought the cause of the Bronze Age collapse? Probably not in the simple way people sometimes imagine. There was no single dry year that swept across every kingdom and made civilization fall over like a row of jars. Climate records from pollen, lake sediments, cave deposits, and other environmental evidence suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East may have experienced drier conditions around the end of the Bronze Age. Some studies point to prolonged aridity. Others warn that the timing, intensity, and local effects varied greatly. That uncertainty matters. Climate evidence is not a royal letter saying, "There has been no rain for 3 years." It is often indirect, reconstructed from changing landscapes and chemical traces. And even a real drought does not tell us automatically what happened in every city. Some regions may have been hit harder than others. Some rulers may have had reserves. Some communities may have adapted by changing crops, moving herds, or relying more heavily on exchange. But a dry period, even an uneven one, would have made an already complicated system much harder to manage. Less rain meant lower harvests. Lower harvests meant fewer taxes collected in grain. Fewer taxes meant smaller stores in palace magazines. Smaller stores meant less ability to pay workers, feed cities, reward allies, or maintain emergency reserves. And once a palace began taking more from farmers during a bad year, it faced another problem. The farmers still had to survive until the next harvest. A king could demand grain as tax. He could send officials into the countryside. He could punish hoarding, order redistribution, or seize supplies intended for local communities. But authority has limits. If there is not enough grain, there is not enough grain. An empire cannot issue a decree commanding barley to grow. This is where food insecurity became a political crisis. Bronze Age kings were expected to do more than wear crowns and receive gifts. They were supposed to maintain order. They protected roads. They settled disputes. They led armies. They honoured the gods. And in practical terms, they made sure the great redistributive machine kept working. When rations stopped, the palace did not merely look inefficient. It looked abandoned by the gods. A hungry workforce could stop producing. A hungry city could become restless. Provincial officials might hold back taxes for their own districts. Local strongmen might take control of stores. Vassal rulers, already wondering whether a distant overlord could protect them, might decide that obedience was no longer worth the cost. Then there were the armies. Armies ran on grain more reliably than on courage. A soldier needs food. So does the mule carrying his equipment. So do the labourers repairing roads, the scribes recording supplies, the garrison guarding a pass, and the crew rowing a warship along an exposed coast. A kingdom facing raids or rebellion needed to mobilize quickly. But mobilization required stores, transport, and dependable routes. If harvests were poor and grain ships were delayed, rulers faced an awful choice: feed the capital, feed the army, or feed the countryside that would produce next year's harvest. They could not always do all three, and this is what made the crisis so cruel. The very conditions that increased the need for armies and fleets may have reduced the ability to supply them. A hungry kingdom had more enemies, more frightened subjects, more desperate migrants, and fewer resources with which to respond. At Ugarit, the harbour had become a place of danger. But beyond the harbour was another danger, quieter and more constant: the possibility that the ships would come and carry no grain. And for the Hittite Empire, this was an especially terrifying possibility. Because Hatti, the kingdom ruled from the great capital of Hattusa, had a problem that Egypt did not. Its heart was nowhere near the sea. Hattusa stood in the highlands of central Anatolia, surrounded by rolling hills, steep ridges, and fields that could support a population in good years, but were never as predictably rich as the floodplain of the Nile. It was a formidable place. Its walls ran for miles across the landscape. Gates were guarded by carved lions and sphinxes. Temples, archives, workshops, storerooms, and royal compounds filled the city. At its height, Hattusa was the command centre of one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. But it was inland, very inland. To reach the Mediterranean world, messages, goods, armies, and grain had to move across long, difficult routes. South through the Taurus Mountains, through the Cilician Plain, into northern Syria, toward the ports and trading cities of the Levant, or westward across Anatolia, through territories that were not always secure toward the Aegean-facing coast. A ship could cross the sea carrying hundreds of jars of grain, copper ingots, timber, cloth, oil, and wine. A cart crossing a mountain road moved much less, more slowly, at greater cost, and every mile created another chance for something to go wrong. A bridge could wash out, a pass could be blocked by snow, animals could die, bandits could attack, a local governor could delay a convoy. A vassal king could decide that supplies were more urgently needed at home. And Hatti depended on these routes not because its rulers were careless, but because empire itself created dependence. The Hittite kings had built a vast political system stretching far beyond the land around Hattusa. They controlled core territories in central Anatolia directly. Beyond those territories lay a complicated world of subordinate kingdoms, treaty partners, client rulers, borderlands, and recently conquered regions. In Syria, cities and kingdoms such as Carchemish, Aleppo, Ugarit, Amurru, and others existed within the Hittite sphere at different times and under different arrangements. In western Anatolia, Hittite kings dealt with powerful local states, some loyal, some hostile, some switching sides whenever the balance of power changed. This was not an empire with modern borders, police stations, and a single uniform bureaucracy. It was an empire held together by relationships. The Hittites were exceptionally good at putting those relationships into writing. Their clay tablets preserved treaties in which vassal kings swore loyalty to the Hittite ruler. They promised to provide troops when summoned. They agreed not to make independent alliances. They were expected to report threats, return fugitives, protect roads, and deliver tribute or supplies. In return, the great king of Hatti promised protection. That promise was everything. A vassal ruler obeyed because Hatti could make obedience worthwhile. The empire could offer military backing against rivals. It could recognize a dynasty as legitimate. It could provide access to trade, prestige goods, royal marriages, diplomatic connections, and perhaps grain in a difficult year. But the same system contained a hidden weakness. The farther away a kingdom was from Hattusa, the more protection depended on roads staying open, officials remaining loyal, and armies being able to arrive before it was too late. A treaty tablet could say that a vassal owed troops. It could not make those troops appear if the roads were unsafe, the harvest had failed, or the vassal king had decided to keep his soldiers at home. And this is where food pressure becomes impossible to separate from imperial power. Hittite sources show rulers deeply concerned with supply. They record deliveries, shortages, obligations, grain movements, and the constant administrative work of making sure people and armies had what they needed. We should be careful not to turn every tablet into evidence of a single empire-wide famine. Ancient documents are fragments. Most of what was written has vanished forever. But the fragments we do have are revealing. Hittite kings sought grain from Egypt. Egyptian texts from the later Bronze Age refer to grain being sent to Hatti, apparently to assist a land facing serious distress. Other records from the Hittite sphere show that grain was moved through Syrian ports and vassal territories, where local rulers were instructed to prepare ships, arrange cargoes, and meet royal demands. That means the empire at Hattusa, despite its military reputation and enormous walls, could depend on food moving from distant places. Just sit with that for a moment. The king of Hatti could command chariots. He could demand hostages from lesser rulers. He could send letters across hundreds of miles sealed with royal authority. His armies had defeated kingdoms that once seemed untouchable. Hittite kings had fought Egypt itself and negotiated peace with pharaohs. And yet the survival of his people could come down to whether grain ships reached a Syrian harbour. If you're enjoying this slow journey through the fragile machinery of the Bronze Age, you can also find the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is waiting in the description. Whenever you feel like exploring a few more ancient questions. For Hatti, crisis did not need to begin at the gates of Hattusa. It could begin much farther away. A poor harvest in Anatolia meant smaller stores. Trouble in northern Syria meant fewer shipments and fewer taxes. Unrest along the coast meant ships could not load safely. War in the west meant troops had to be diverted. A rebellious vassal meant one more road was uncertain, one more garrison needed food, one more local ruler who might not answer the king's letter. And there were always letters. The Hittite archive gives us a sense of an empire permanently in motion. Orders sent, reports received, complaints investigated, border disputes settled, troops requested, messengers dispatched. Officials reminded of duties they had apparently been reminded of before. This was not a still, effortless empire. It was a machine that had to be kept running every day. The palace at Hattusa needed scribes to record obligations. It needed officials to collect goods. It needed warehouses to hold supplies. It needed loyal provincial authorities. It needed roads. It needed draft animals, it needed soldiers who could be called up, fed, equipped, and sent wherever the next emergency appeared. Most of all, it needed people to believe that Hatti was still powerful enough to matter. During stable decades, that belief could travel a very long way. During a cascading crisis, distance became deadly. Around the end of the 13th century and into the early 12th century BC, the evidence for Hittite central authority begins to fade. The final years are difficult to reconstruct. We have no single document explaining exactly what happened. No Hittite king left behind a neat account saying, "Here is why the empire ended." Instead, we see absence. The great archive of Hattusa falls silent. The capital was abandoned and later burned, though the precise sequence remains debated. The imperial administration that had coordinated treaties, armies, taxes, and grain shipments disappears from the record. The Hittite state did not simply shrink into a smaller version of itself. The centre was gone. Some Hittite traditions survived in southern Anatolia and northern Syria. Later kingdoms continued to use Luwian and Hittite cultural forms. Rulers still carved monuments, cities still lived. People did not vanish. But the great king at Hattusa, the palace system, the far-reaching web of obligations that had connected Anatolia to Syria and the Mediterranean, had broken apart. And when that central authority disappeared, every distant vassal, every exposed road, every hungry garrison, and every uncertain port was suddenly on its own. Far to the west, beyond the mountains and across the sea lanes that no longer felt secure, another palace world was about to discover the same terrible lesson. Across the water from Anatolia, at the far western edge of the great Bronze Age network, stood the palace kingdoms of Mycenaean Greece. This was not yet the Greece of classical temples, philosophers, or democracy. It was a world of fortified hilltops, royal storehouses, painted halls, chariots, warriors, and scribes, pressing signs into wet clay. At places like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and perhaps Athens, powerful rulers governed small but ambitious kingdoms. Each palace controlled the surrounding countryside. Farmers, herders, craftsmen, local officials and religious personnel all fed goods into the centre. Grain, olives, wool, wine, livestock, bronze, textiles, perfume, oils, leather and labour. And the palace sent things back out. Rations, equipment, status, orders, protection, at least in theory. The Mycenaeans left behind an extraordinary accidental record of this system. Their scribes wrote in Linear B, an early form of Greek, on small clay tablets. Most of these tablets were never meant to last. They were temporary records, lists and inventories kept for a season or a year, then recycled when no longer needed. But when palace buildings burned, the fire baked the clay hard. Disaster preserved the paperwork. So thousands of years later we can still read entries recording sheep flocks, bronze allocations, chariot wheels, workers in textile workshops, containers of oil, men assigned to watch posts, and offerings due to gods whose names would still be recognizable in later Greek religion. The tablets do not give us a complete picture. They are not diaries. They rarely explain why something happened. They are the voice of administration, which is useful, but never neutral. A palace clerk writes down what the palace needs counted. Still, they show us something unmistakable. Mycenaean Greece was deeply organized around palace centers, and those centers were not isolated fortresses at the edge of Europe. They were connected to the widest commercial and diplomatic system the Mediterranean had ever seen. Crete was especially important. The Mycenaeans had inherited, adapted, and perhaps forcibly absorbed parts of the older Minoan world after the great Cretan palace age had already begun to change. At Knossos, Linear B tablets appear in a setting that suggests Greek-speaking Mycenaean administration, though the exact political story remains complicated. From Crete came maritime knowledge, artistic styles, religious influences, skilled crafts, and access to the southern sea lanes. Cyprus supplied copper, the foundation of bronze production. Anatolia provided connections to powerful kingdoms, contested coastlines, and perhaps metals, horses, textiles, and elite goods. Egypt offered gold, ivory, luxury objects, grain in some circumstances, and the prestige of contact with one of the ancient world's greatest courts. The Levant provided timber, glass, dyes, finely worked objects, oils, and access to markets stretching beyond the Mediterranean itself. Mycenaean pottery has been found from Cyprus to the Levant and Egypt. Mycenaean-style goods travelled widely, sometimes as exports, sometimes carried by merchants, settlers, diplomats, or people whose identities we can no longer recover. Egyptian records refer to people commonly identified with the Aegean world. Hittite texts mention Ahiyawa, a powerful land across the sea that many scholars connect with the Mycenaean Greeks, though the precise relationship remains debated. What matters is this: the palaces of Greece were plugged into the same network that linked Hatti, Ugarit, Cyprus, Canaan, Crete, and Egypt. They were far away from many of the places that supplied them, and distance was not safety. In fact, distance could make dependence harder to see. A ruler at Pylos could look over the green hills of Messenia, see fields, herds, villages, and storerooms, and feel secure. The palace itself stood inland above the coast. Mycenae rose behind massive stone walls in the Argolid. Tiryns was protected by fortifications so enormous that later Greeks believed giants had built them. But bronze did not come from those walls. Tin did not grow in the fields. Luxury goods, diplomatic contacts, foreign timber, and many of the raw materials that sustained elite life depended on ships continuing to arrive. And by the late 13th century BC, the Mycenaean world appears to have been worried. At Pylos, some of the final Linear B tablets record men assigned to guard stretches of coastline. The language is bureaucratic, almost painfully calm. Named officials, named locations, groups of watchers. But the implication is difficult to ignore. Someone expected danger from the sea. At Mycenae and Tiryns, major defensive works were expanded or strengthened in the later palace period. At Tiryns, a protected water supply was incorporated within the fortifications, allowing defenders access to water during a siege. At Mycenae, new walls and guarded approaches made the citadel more formidable. None of this proves that an invasion had begun. Fortifications can reflect rivalry, prestige, long-term planning, or fear of threats that never arrive. But it does tell us that rulers were investing heavily in survival. Then the palaces began to fall. The destruction was not one single event on one single night. The dates vary from place to place. Some centres suffered damage earlier and recovered. Thebes was badly affected before the final wave of collapse. Pylos was destroyed around the beginning of the 12th century BC and was never rebuilt as a palace centre. Mycenae and Tiryns survived in reduced forms for a time, but their palace systems were gone. Across Greece, settlements were abandoned, populations shifted, and the administrative world of Linear B fell silent. Again, the silence matters. No later tablet tells us how to restore the palace. No clerk records a new shipment of bronze for the king. No central bureaucracy returns. It is tempting to imagine a single invading army sweeping down from the north, or raiders pouring ashore from the sea. Later Greek traditions told stories of returning heroes, dynastic struggles, and great wars. Those stories may preserve distant memories, but they were written down centuries later. They cannot serve as straightforward reports from the collapse itself. Archaeology can show burned buildings, broken storage jars, abandoned rooms, repaired walls, and changed settlement patterns. It cannot always tell us who lit the fire. Outside attack is possible in some places. Internal revolt is possible. So are earthquakes, local warfare, drought, food shortage, political succession crises, piracy, and the sudden failure of trade. Most likely, different communities experience different combinations of trouble. But the larger pattern is clear enough. The Mycenaean palaces were built to gather resources, organize labour, arm warriors, and display royal power. They were impressive machines. They were also machines that depended on movement. When the wider world became less predictable, the far end of the network did not remain safely distant. It became stranded, but if Mycenaean Greece became stranded, what about Egypt? Egypt was different. It was larger than the palace kingdoms of the Aegean. It had the Nile, an agricultural system capable of producing enormous grain surpluses in good years, a long tradition of centralized administration and borders partly protected by desert, sea, and difficult terrain. Its rulers commanded more people, more land, and more resources than the kings of Pylos or Ugarit ever could. When the Bronze Age world began to fracture, Egypt did not disappear. But surviving is not the same as remaining unchanged. By the early 12th century BC, Egypt had already been fighting to preserve its position in a Mediterranean world that was becoming increasingly dangerous. During the reign of Ramesses III, around 1180 BC, Egyptian records describe attacks by groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. The most famous account is carved on the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The reliefs are dramatic. Ships collide in crowded water. Archers fire from shore. Egyptian soldiers fight enemies wearing distinctive feathered headdresses. Captives are led away. Ramesses appears, as pharaohs always appear in royal monuments, huge, calm, victorious, and absolutely in control. The inscriptions tell an even larger story. They describe foreign lands destroyed. Hatti, the Hittite heartland, is named among places said to have been overwhelmed. Cyprus, or Al-Ashia, may also be alluded to. Then these moving peoples with warriors, women, children, and ox carts are said to have come toward Egypt. It is an extraordinary image, not simply raiders arriving for loot, but whole communities on the move. But we should be careful here. Medinet Habu is not a neutral news report. It is a royal victory monument. Its job was to show that Ramesses III had saved Egypt from chaos. Egyptian kings had been defeating terrifying enemies in temple art for more than 1,000 years. The king wins because the king must win. That is how the universe is supposed to work. Still, the threat was probably real. Egyptian texts describe fighting on land and at sea. They name groups such as the Peliset, often connected by scholars with the later Philistines, along with the Cheka, Shurdan, Denyen, and Weshish. Some may have come from the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, the central Mediterranean, or the Levant. Some may have been migrants displaced by famine and war. Some may have been mercenaries, pirates, local rebels, or survivors joining whatever armed coalition offered food and protection. Sea Peoples makes them sound like one nation with one leader and one plan. They probably were not. It may be better to think of the term as an Egyptian label for several groups appearing in the same violent, mobile, confused age. People moving through a collapsing system, some attacking it, some fleeing it, some doing both. Ramesses III appears to have stopped them at Egypt's borders. The land battle is usually placed somewhere in the eastern Nile Delta. The naval battle, whatever its exact location, seems to have involved Egypt drawing enemy ships into a confined space where archers on shore and Egyptian vessels could overwhelm them. Egypt held, and that mattered. If Egypt had fallen too, the old Eastern Mediterranean system might have vanished even more completely than it did. Egyptian administration continued. Temples continued to receive offerings. Scribes continued to write. The Nile still rose each year. Grain was still harvested, stored, taxed, and distributed. But the world Egypt had defended was already gone. Egypt had never been as self-sufficient as its monumental temples might suggest. The Nile supplied food. Gold came from Nubia. Stone came from Egyptian quarries. But palaces and temples also depended on connections beyond the valley. Lebanon provided prized cedar timber. Cyprus supplied copper. The Levant supplied wine, oil, timber, skilled goods, dyes, and access to markets farther east. Mediterranean trade brought prestige objects, exotic materials, and sometimes desperately needed supplies. Even Egypt's bronze economy depended on the same vulnerable chain as everyone else's. Copper had to move. Tin had to move, ships had to arrive. When coastal cities burned, when Cyprus became unstable, when old merchants vanished and foreign courts stopped sending gifts, Egypt could not simply command the network back into existence. It could defend the delta. It could not defend every harbour between the Nile and the Aegean. And inside Egypt, the pressure was building. Ramesses III fought expensive wars. He maintained armies, chariots, fortresses, fleets, temples, and a vast royal household. All of this required grain, labour, and a functioning bureaucracy. But the state's resources were not unlimited. Evidence from his reign suggests repeated difficulties in supplying workers and institutions. At Deir el-Medina, the village of craftsmen who built and decorated royal tombs, workers eventually stopped working because their grain rations had not arrived. This is often described as the first recorded labour strike in history. Picture that for a moment. The men responsible for creating the pharaoh's path into eternity. Skilled workers serving one of the most powerful states on earth, sitting down and refusing to continue because the state had failed to feed them on time. They were not demanding abstract political rights. They wanted bread. The missing rations may have reflected poor harvests, corruption, administrative failure, war costs, transport problems, or several of these at once. We do not have a single simple answer, but the message is clear enough. The machinery of redistribution was slipping. There were also plots and struggles at court. Ramesses III survived a conspiracy later known as the Harem Conspiracy, though he may have died soon after, possibly from wounds inflicted during the plot. His successors ruled an Egypt still powerful enough to endure, but increasingly divided between royal officials, military interests, and wealthy temple institutions. The new kingdom did not collapse in one blaze of fire. It thinned out. Its reach became shorter. Its foreign influence weakened. Egypt gradually lost control over parts of its empire in Canaan and Syria. The old diplomatic world of great kings exchanging gifts, princesses, gold, horses, and promises became smaller, poorer, and less reliable. Egypt remained on the map, but it was no longer standing at the centre of the same map. And this is the strange truth of the Bronze Age collapse. A state could win the battle and still lose the world that made its old power possible. So who were the Sea Peoples? The honest answer is that we do not know, not completely, and that uncertainty is important, because for more than a century, people have tried to turn a handful of Egyptian names into a single clean explanation for the collapse of the Bronze Age. A terrifying invasion, one giant fleet, one final war that destroyed the old world. It makes for a simple story. It is probably not what happened. Sea Peoples is a modern term, not the name these groups used for themselves. Egyptian texts do not give us a united nation called the Sea Peoples, with a capital city, a king, a language, and a flag. They give us lists, names appearing in different records at different times, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as prisoners, sometimes perhaps as soldiers in Egyptian service. The names include the Shurdan, Luka, Shekelish, Peleset, Cheka, Denyen, and Weshesh. They sound like fragments because that is what they are. Fragments preserved in the words of Egyptian scribes who were trying to describe a dangerous and changing world from the perspective of the Nile Valley. Some names seem to point toward particular regions. The Luka are often connected with Lycia on the southwest coast of Anatolia, because Hittite records also describe people from that region as troublesome seaborne fighters. The Peleset are frequently linked to the Philistines, who later appear in the southern Levant. The Shurdan have sometimes been associated with Sardinia, the Shekelish with Sicily, the Denyen with groups known from the Aegean or Anatolia. But each connection comes with a warning label. A similar sounding name is not proof. Ancient names moved, peoples moved. Egyptians could use broad labels for outsiders. Later traditions may preserve old memories, or they may not. And even if one group began in Sardinia, another in Anatolia, and another in the Aegean, that would not mean they all came together from a single homeland. It might mean exactly the opposite, that the Eastern Mediterranean had become a place where displaced groups, sailors, mercenaries, refugees, pirates, farmers, and former palace soldiers were all being pushed into motion at once. Think about the world they were entering. For centuries, ships had carried copper, tin, grain, timber, pottery, weapons, textiles, luxury goods, messengers, diplomats, and royal gifts across these waters. Ports were not isolated dots on a map. They were meeting places. A sailor from Cyprus could encounter merchants from Ugarit, soldiers from the Aegean, Egyptian officials, Canaanite traders, and Anatolian envoys all within a few days of travel. When that system worked, mobility created wealth. When it broke down, mobility could create armed bands. A palace that could no longer distribute grain might leave trained fighters unpaid. A drought could push rural families toward the coast. A city destroyed in war could send survivors onto ships or carts, looking for a place where food still existed. Merchants who lost their cargoes might become smugglers. Sailors who lost their employers might hire themselves out as mercenaries. Local rulers, short of troops, might recruit them. And a group that began as refugees could become raiders if the alternative was starvation. This is why the categories do not stay separate. Were they raiders? Some almost certainly were. Coastal settlements were attacked. Egyptian records describe real battles. The weapons, ships, and burned cities of this period do not allow us to pretend that everyone was peacefully relocating. Were they migrants? The Medinet Habu inscription describes people moving with women, children, and ox carts. That does not sound like a purely military expedition. It sounds like communities trying to relocate under extreme pressure. Were they mercenaries? Very possibly. The Shurden, for example, appear in Egyptian sources before the reign of Ramesses III. Under Ramesses II, generations earlier, Shurden warriors served in the Egyptian army. They were not simply enemies beyond the horizon. At least some had been absorbed into the military world of Egypt itself. Were they armies? In certain moments, yes. Groups could form coalitions. They could coordinate attacks. They could gather ships, weapons, and fighting men. But an army does not have to be the army of one nation. It can be a temporary force assembled from people with different origins and different reasons for joining. That may be the key. The Sea Peoples may not have caused the Bronze Age collapse in the way an invading empire causes the fall of a kingdom. They may instead have been one of the most visible symptoms of a system already coming apart. Imagine a network under pressure from poor harvests, disrupted trade, unpaid soldiers, political rebellion, and failing palace authority. At first one port is raided, then another ruler cannot pay his garrison. Then refugees arrive at a neighbouring coast. Then local leaders arm them, hire them, or fight them. Then the ships that once carried tin and grain begin carrying desperate people and weapons. Violence spreads, not because one mastermind controls it all, but because every failure makes the next failure more likely. And Egyptian inscriptions, for all their royal exaggeration, preserve a glimpse of that process. They show named groups appearing in a moment of crisis. But they do not explain where every group came from, how long they had been moving, whether they spoke the same languages or whether they remained united after the fighting ended. Some groups may have settled. Some may have been defeated, captured and resettled by Egypt. Some may have disappeared into older populations. Some may have been remembered under new names. The Peliset, if they are connected with the Philistines, seem to have established communities in the southern Levant after this period. Archaeology suggests that early Philistine culture included Aegean influences. but it also quickly blended with local traditions. That is what migration often looks like in real life. Not a people arriving unchanged from a single distant homeland, but newcomers and locals adapting to one another in a damaged landscape. So the question is not just, who were the sea peoples? The deeper question is, what kind of world produces them? A world where trade has stopped moving reliably, where grain is scarce, where states cannot protect coasts or pay troops, where the old rules no longer work, where people who once had jobs, land, patrons, and identities inside a stable system suddenly have none of those things. In that kind of world, the sea becomes more than a highway for commerce. It becomes an escape route, a battlefield, and, for some, the only road left. And once the sea became an escape route, a battlefield, and the only road left, every kingdom around it faced the same terrible problem. How do you keep order when keeping order costs more every year? The late Bronze Age empires were not simple blocks of territory ruled from one capital. They were layered systems. A great king in Egypt, Hatti, Mycenaean Greece, or Assyria did not personally control every village, mountain pass, harbour, and grain field. Power travelled outward through governors, local rulers, vassal kings, garrisons, tax collectors, messengers and gifts. And all of them had to be maintained. A border fortress needed food. Its soldiers needed wages, weapons, clothing, horses and replacements. A local ruler needed to feel that loyalty was more profitable than rebellion. A merchant needed to believe the road ahead was safer than the road behind. A neighbouring king needed diplomatic gifts, flattering letters, marriage alliances, perhaps a shipment of gold, copper, ivory, textiles or grain. Empire was not a thing you built once and owned forever. It was a bill that arrived every day. The Hittite Empire understood this especially well. Its heartland lay in central Anatolia, far from many of the places that mattered most. To the south were the rich cities and ports of Syria. To the west were unstable coastal regions and the kingdoms of Azawar. To the east were powerful rivals and difficult mountain routes. Every distant province was connected to Hattusa by roads, messengers, officials, and the willingness of local elites to obey. That willingness could change quickly. Hittite texts are full of complaints about troublesome vassals, disputed borders, missing tribute, and rulers suspected of switching sides. A vassal king might swear loyalty to the great king one year, then look toward Egypt, Assyria, or a nearby rival the next. Not necessarily because he was uniquely treacherous. Sometimes because the balance of power had shifted. If Hittite troops were far away, if grain shipments failed, if local enemies were growing stronger, then loyalty could begin to look like a dangerous luxury. And when a vassal rebelled, the answer was usually expensive. You sent an army. That meant gathering troops from across the kingdom. It meant taking farmers away from fields at the very moment food supplies might already be strained. It meant feeding men and animals along long roads. It meant issuing weapons from palace stores, moving chariots, finding fodder for horses, and convincing subordinate rulers to send the soldiers they owed. A military campaign could restore order. It could also consume the resources needed to keep ordinary life functioning. Picture a harvest that has been poor for 2 years. The palace granaries are lower than expected. A frontier governor sends word that raiders have crossed the border. A vassal city has stopped delivering tribute. Another ruler is asking for grain. Not next season, but now. The king must decide where the remaining food goes. To hungry villages? To the army? To a diplomatic gift shipment meant to keep an ally from defecting? There may have been no good answer, and this is where the old system became vulnerable to its own scale. In a smaller kingdom, a ruler might lose a town and still keep control of the rest. But a great palace economy depended on many moving parts. Grain from one district, copper from another, timber from the mountains, tin from distant traders, taxes from vassals, ships arriving at ports on schedule. If enough of those parts failed at once, the palace did not simply become poorer. It became less able to act, less able to reward loyalty, less able to punish disobedience, less able to protect roads, less able to reassure frightened communities that help was coming. And people noticed. We should be careful here, because the surviving evidence rarely gives us the thoughts of farmers, labourers, sailors, or conscripted soldiers. Palace archives preserve the voices of administrators. Royal inscriptions celebrate victories. They do not usually say our workers are exhausted, our villagers are angry, and our officials are corrupt. But archaeology and texts leave room for the possibility of internal tension. Palace systems concentrated wealth and authority at the top. They collected crops, animals, labour, and manufactured goods, then redistributed them according to royal priorities. In stable times, this could be remarkably effective. It could feed specialists, support armies, finance building projects, and maintain long-distance trade. In hard times, it could feel very different. If a palace demanded grain after a failed harvest, villagers might hide supplies or flee. If labour obligations increased, workers might resist, desert, or simply become too weak to continue. If elites believed the king could no longer protect them, they might begin building their own local power. Some may have withheld tribute, some may have made deals with rivals. Some may have settled old scores that palace authority had kept contained for generations. Not every burned site was the result of foreign invasion. Some destruction may reflect local conflict. Some may represent abandonment. Some may have been caused by accident, earthquake, or later rebuilding. But across the eastern Mediterranean, the pattern is hard to ignore. In many places, old centres of authority were becoming less secure exactly when they needed to be strongest. Succession disputes made everything worse. A kingdom could survive a bad harvest. It might survive a border war. It might even survive the loss of a province. But when a king died and several people claimed the throne, every unresolved problem suddenly became political ammunition. Armies had to choose sides. Vassals waited to see who would win. Rivals invaded disputed territory. Officials delayed decisions. Tribute stopped moving. A brother, son, uncle, or military commander might promise local rulers a better deal than the palace had offered before. The Hittite royal family had experienced such tensions long before the final collapse. So had other Bronze Age states. Dynasties were never as solid as later monuments make them appear. Behind the formal language of treaties and royal marriages were ambitious families, competing court factions, resentful vassals and generals with armed men at their command. A succession crisis did not need to destroy an empire by itself. It only needed to arrive at the wrong time, and by the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the wrong time seemed to be everywhere. War drew men away from farms. Farms produced less grain. Less grain made armies harder to supply. Unsupplied armies became unreliable, and unreliable armies could turn from protectors into another burden on the people they were meant to defend. Roads became dangerous. Caravans needed guards. Merchants raised prices, avoided risky routes, or stopped travelling altogether. At sea, the same logic applied. A port was only useful if ships believed they could enter safely, unload safely, and leave with cargo. But when local rulers were fighting, when garrisons were unpaid, when refugees crowded the coast, and when raiding had become profitable, the harbour itself could become a trap. A merchant carrying copper or grain did not need a continent-wide collapse to lose everything. He only needed one unsafe road, one hostile checkpoint, one unpaid garrison, one desperate crew. One port where the king's seal no longer meant protection. And when merchants stopped trusting the routes, trade did not merely become slower. It began to disappear. That was the hidden cost of war and revolt. Not only the dead in battles, not only the cities burned. It was the quiet destruction of confidence, the belief that a promise would be honoured, a shipment would arrive, a road would remain open, and a ruler could still keep the peace. Once that belief started to fail, the entire network began to shake. And once the network began to shake, the damage did not have to spread everywhere at the same speed. It only had to spread far enough. Imagine one ordinary disruption. A ship carrying copper ingots from Cyprus is delayed. Maybe storms drove it off course. Maybe pirates took the cargo. Maybe the harbour it was meant to reach was no longer safe. Perhaps the local ruler who guaranteed its protection had been overthrown, or perhaps the crew simply decided the risk was too great. One missing ship does not destroy a civilization, but now imagine that ship was expected by a palace workshop. The workshop had smiths. The smiths had charcoal, furnaces, moulds, hammers, apprentices, and orders from the palace. They were supposed to produce tools for farmers, fittings for chariots, spearheads for soldiers, blades for guards, prestige objects for nobles, and diplomatic gifts for foreign rulers. But bronze required copper and tin. No copper, no bronze. No tin, no bronze. And tin was often the harder material to replace, arriving from very distant sources through a chain of traders, ports, middlemen, and agreements. So the palace workshop begins making less. At first, perhaps nothing looks dramatic. Old tools are repaired instead of replaced. Weapons are collected, melted down, and reused. A governor is told his order will arrive next month. A gift shipment is reduced. A local ruler receives fewer bronze vessels than expected, or a smaller payment than the one promised in the treaty. But people at the edge of a kingdom do not experience this as an abstract supply problem. They experience it as a message. The garrison commander sees that replacement weapons are not coming. The farmer sees that his broken sickle cannot be easily repaired. The chariot officer sees fewer fittings in the storehouse. The vassal king sees a gift that once signalled friendship and power reduced to an apology written on a clay tablet. And each person begins making different calculations. Maybe the farmer keeps more grain at home because he no longer trusts the palace to protect him through the winter. Maybe the merchant chooses not to sail. Maybe the governor starts saving supplies for his own troops instead of forwarding them to the capital. Maybe the vassal king sends secret messages to a rival power, asking who might protect him if the old alliance fails. This is how a trade failure can become a political failure. The palace economy depended on movement, grain moving from productive districts to cities and armies, metals moving from mines and ports to workshops, finished goods moving outward as payment, reward, and proof that the king still had access to the wealth of the world, tribute moving inward, gifts moving outward, orders, reports, messengers, and soldiers moving in every direction. If the routes became unreliable, the palace lost more than cargo. It lost timing, and timing mattered. Grain that arrives after the hungry season is not the same as grain that arrives before it. Weapons delivered after a frontier town has fallen are not much use. A gift sent after an ally has already chosen another side, cannot restore the old relationship. Bronze was valuable partly because it was durable and effective, but also because its production could be organized and controlled. A ruler who could distribute bronze objects was distributing visible evidence of power. When that supply faltered, authority could begin to look hollow. Then the feedback loops begin. A poor harvest creates hunger. Hunger makes people move, steal, resist taxation, or seek protection elsewhere. The palace responds by sending grain, lowering obligations or deploying soldiers. But all of those responses cost resources. If revenue is already falling because trade is disrupted and vassals are withholding tribute, the palace has fewer options. So taxes may rise, labour demands may increase, grain may be taken from communities that can barely spare it, that can create more resentment, more flight, and less production next season. Fewer farmers in the fields means a smaller harvest. A smaller harvest means less grain for workers, garrisons, and ships. Unpaid soldiers become unreliable. Unreliable soldiers make roads less safe. Unsafe roads reduce trade further. The system begins feeding on its own weakness. Insecurity also made metal shortages worse. Mines needed workers. Smelting needed fuel. Caravans needed guards. Ships needed crews willing to sail into uncertain waters. Even if copper still existed in Cyprus, and tin still existed somewhere beyond the eastern mountains, getting those materials from one place to another required confidence. It required people to believe contracts mattered, storehouses would not be looted, and the road home would still be open. When that confidence disappeared, supplies could remain physically available while becoming economically unreachable. This is important. The Bronze Age collapse was not necessarily one giant moment, when every route failed and every kingdom fell in the same order. The evidence does not give us a single universal sequence. Different regions faced different pressures. Some cities were destroyed violently. Others declined gradually. Some states endured, including Egypt and Assyria, though they emerged changed. Some trade continued, and some communities adapted with remarkable resilience. So this is not direct proof that one missed shipment caused one rebellion, which caused one burned palace, which caused the whole eastern Mediterranean to collapse like a row of carefully arranged stones. It is a systems model, a plausible way of understanding why so many separate problems could become connected. A drought in one region could increase demand for imported grain. War along one coast could make shipping more expensive. A rebellion could cut a road. A lost port could delay metal deliveries. Missing metal could weaken armies and workshops. Weaker armies could encourage more raiding. More raiding could send more refugees toward already stressed lands. Each shock was manageable on its own. Together, they became harder to contain. That was the danger of interdependence. The late Bronze Age world was wealthy because it was connected. Its palaces had access to materials, skills, luxuries, and information that no isolated kingdom could easily produce alone. But the same connections that made the system powerful also gave failure a way to travel. And once failure began travelling faster than help, the old world faced a problem it had never truly solved. How do you repair a network when the network itself is what has broken? The obvious answer might seem simple. Find another route. Use another metal. Buy grain somewhere else. Send more soldiers. Raise more taxes. Tell the local governors to work harder. Tell the merchants to sail anyway. From a distance of more than 3,000 years, it can seem strange that the great powers of the late Bronze Age did not simply adjust. Egypt had immense wealth. The Hittite Empire controlled vast territories. Mycenaean palaces had workshops, scribes, storehouses, ships, warriors, and long experience dealing with foreign kingdoms. These were not helpless societies. They had survived wars, bad harvests, palace intrigues, border raids, and the deaths of kings before. But adapting to one problem is very different from adapting to many problems at once. A palace bureaucracy was powerful, because it could gather resources from a wide area and direct them toward a specific need. If a frontier needed soldiers, officials could requisition grain, weapons, carts, and labour. If a harvest failed in one district, grain might be moved from another. If a foreign ruler demanded gifts, palace workshops could produce fine textiles, decorated vessels, ivory carvings, and bronze weapons. On a clay tablet it looks almost effortless. A list of sheep, a shipment of grain, a payment of copper, workers assigned to a textile room, chariot wheels counted, jars sealed, a message sent to a governor. But every line on every tablet depended on real people doing real work in the right place at the right time. Someone had to grow the grain, someone had to collect it, someone had to guard the storehouse, someone had to keep the records, someone had to load the carts, sail the ships, repair the roads, feed the animals, make the tools, enforce the orders, and carry messages across a world becoming less safe by the season. A palace could respond to a crisis if the rest of its machinery was still functioning. But what happens when the machinery itself starts coming apart? Take the scribes. These men, and perhaps in some places women, were not simply people who could write. They were trained specialists. They understood the administrative systems of their palace. They knew which symbols recorded grain, which names belonged to which districts, what obligations were owed, where supplies were supposed to go, and what had arrived last year. If a palace burned, its clay tablets might survive in the fire. Ironically, baking could preserve them for archaeologists thousands of years later. But the people who understood the tablets might not survive. And even if they did, they could not necessarily recreate the system somewhere else. Literacy in many late Bronze Age kingdoms was tied closely to the palace. It was not spread widely through every village. A scribe without an archive, a storehouse, officials, messengers, and a king able to enforce orders was like a navigator standing beside an empty harbour. He still had the knowledge, but the world that made that knowledge useful had vanished. The same was true for craftsmen. A bronze smith could not make bronze from skill alone. He needed copper, tin, charcoal, clay for moulds, tools for shaping metal, assistants, food, and a customer wealthy enough to pay for the finished object. A chariot maker needed timber, leather, bronze fittings, wheels, animals, and trained drivers. An ivory worker needed imported ivory. A purple dye workshop needed access to coastal resources and trade connections. A palace textile industry needed wool, flax, dyes, spinners, weavers, supervisors, and storage rooms. Specialization creates extraordinary things, but specialization also creates dependence. A small farming village could survive with fewer luxuries. It could repair old tools, improvise containers, trade locally, and rely on family labour. A palace, however, was built around coordination. It needed surpluses moving inward, and orders moving outward. It needed thousands of people to continue doing narrow, organised tasks. When that coordination failed, the palace could not simply become a village with a crown on top. And replacement was harder than it sounds. Could a kingdom find another source of tin? Possibly, but tin was not lying in every riverbed or hillside. Its sources were limited, distant, and often reached through long chains of exchange. A ruler might know that tin existed somewhere beyond the mountains or across the sea. That did not mean he had a safe road, reliable traders, pack animals, guards, credit, diplomatic agreements, or a functioning port to obtain it. Even a substitute route could become a trap. If one safe harbour was lost, every merchant might crowd toward the next available harbour. Prices would rise, ships would wait longer. Local rulers could demand greater payments. Raiders would know where valuable cargoes were now concentrated. The alternative route might be longer, more dangerous, and too expensive for ordinary trade. And then there was iron. Iron would eventually become more common across the eastern Mediterranean. It is tempting to imagine it arriving as a quick replacement for bronze, like a newer and better tool appearing just when the old one failed. But history rarely works that neatly. Early ironworking required its own skills, fuels, furnaces, and supply chains. Iron ore was more widely available than tin, but turning it into useful metal was difficult. The quality could vary. Producing dependable iron tools and weapons on a large scale took time. It was not a switch a collapsing palace could flip in the middle of famine, war, and disrupted trade. Gradual adaptation is possible when institutions have time. A state can test new routes, train new smiths, build new harbours, negotiate with unfamiliar partners, move populations, change taxes carefully, store reserves over several good years. But abrupt breakdown removes time. It also removes trust. A merchant will invest in a dangerous voyage if he believes the destination port is open. The ruler will honour agreements, the warehouse will be secure, and payment will arrive. A farmer will surrender grain if he believes the palace can protect him through winter. A local governor will send troops to the capital if he believes his own town will not be abandoned. Once those beliefs weaken, each person has a rational reason to hold back. The merchant stays home, the farmer hides grain, the governor keeps soldiers nearby. The village closes its gates, and the palace, which depends on resources flowing toward the centre, receives less and less. This is why elite networks could become dangerous in a crisis. They concentrated wealth, information, skilled labour, and political power in palaces and ports. In good times, that concentration made kingdoms impressive. In bad times, it could leave ordinary communities exposed. A village might have been expected to send away grain even as its own harvest failed. It might lose young men to armies protecting distant borders. It might depend on palace workshops for metal tools that no longer arrived. And when the palace could no longer provide security in return, the old bargain began to dissolve. The king promised order, the palace collected the surplus. The roads stayed open, the ships came. Then, slowly or suddenly, they did not. And for people far from the royal halls, adaptation did not mean redesigning an economic system. It meant surviving until the next harvest. It meant deciding whether to flee, fight, hide, or remain in a smaller and poorer world. Because after the palaces failed, many people did survive. But they survived differently. For some, survival meant leaving. A hilltop that had once been too steep, too rocky, too inconvenient for a prosperous town, could suddenly become the safest place in the region. Archaeologists see signs of this in many parts of the eastern Mediterranean after the palace world broke apart. Settlements shift uphill. They become smaller. Defences matter more. Houses cluster together where people can watch the roads, the valleys, or the coastline below. Not every move was caused by a single attack. Some communities may have been following water, farmland, or new local political leaders. But the general pattern is hard to miss. People were choosing security over convenience. The great lowland centres had depended on open routes. They needed carts bringing grain from the countryside, merchants arriving at harbours, officials moving between districts, and messengers carrying orders. A fortified village on a ridge did not need all of that. It could be harder to reach, harder to raid, and easier to defend with a few dozen determined people. The price was isolation. A household that had once received imported pottery, bronze tools, fine cloth, and goods from far away, might now rely on what it could grow, make, repair, or obtain from neighbouring settlements. Long-distance exchange did not vanish completely. The sea did not become empty, and people did not forget how to sail. But trade became thinner, more uncertain, and often more local. A ship crossing the sea was no longer simply carrying cargo. It was taking a risk. Would the harbour be open? Would there be a ruler capable of protecting merchants? Would there be grain to buy, metal to exchange, or a market with enough wealth to make the voyage worthwhile? Would the people waiting on shore be traders, refugees, soldiers, or raiders? In the Old Palace Age, a merchant could depend, at least in theory, on a chain of agreements stretching from one kingdom to another. After the collapse, that chain had broken into smaller pieces. And smaller pieces are harder to trust. This changed the rhythm of life. Instead of great centralized storehouses, there were more household granaries. Instead of palace workshops producing goods for an entire kingdom, there were local craftspeople working for villages, chiefs, temples, or whoever could provide food and protection. Instead of officials collecting and redistributing vast amounts of grain, communities may have depended more heavily on kinship, mutual obligation, and the decisions of local leaders. It was a smaller world, not empty, not primitive, not silent, just less connected. One of the clearest signs comes from writing. In Mycenaean Greece, the linear B writing system disappears after the destruction of the palaces. The script had been used mainly for administration, recording livestock, land, rations, textiles, workers, and offerings. When the palaces vanished, so did the bureaucratic world that required those records. For centuries, Greece appears to have had no writing system in regular use. This does not mean people became less intelligent. It means a specialized skill lost the institutions that supported it. A farmer did not need linear B to plant barley. A shepherd did not need it to know his animals. A potter could still shape clay, fire a kiln, and teach a child the trade. Oral memory could preserve family histories, local boundaries, religious practices, songs, laws, and stories long after tablets stopped being written. But without archives, tax records, palace inventories, and official correspondence, governments could no longer manage society in the same way. They could not easily count every sheep. They could not easily track every shipment. They could not easily command labour across a whole region from a central hall. The loss was not merely literary, it was administrative. It was the loss of complexity that depended on trained scribes, secure storehouses, predictable taxes, and enough stability for orders to travel farther than a day's walk. Yet collapse was uneven. That matters. The Late Bronze Age did not end in exactly the same way everywhere, and it did not end at exactly the same time. Some cities were violently destroyed. Some were abandoned. Some shrank and continued. Some coastal communities adapted to new patterns of trade. Egypt survived as a state, though it emerged poorer, more divided, and less dominant in the eastern Mediterranean than before. In Anatolia, the Hittite imperial system disappeared, but people did not disappear with it. Communities remained, languages endured, and later kingdoms would rise among the ruins and memories of the old world. Across the Levant, older cities suffered deeply, but new settlements also appeared. Inland farming communities continued planting fields. Herds still needed tending. Fishing villages still looked toward the sea. Craftspeople still made pottery, cloth, tools, ornaments and weapons, though often on a different scale, and for different customers. This is one of the quiet truths hidden behind the word collapse. Palaces can vanish quickly. Ordinary life rarely does. A king may lose his capital in a night. A dynasty may disappear from the records. A port may burn, but people still wake before dawn. They still grind grain. They still mend roofs. They still worry about rain, illness, hungry children, and whether strangers on the road mean danger. And they still remember, perhaps not in written archives. Perhaps in stories told beside hearths, in inherited skills, in familiar field boundaries, in the names of springs and hills, in rituals whose original meaning had already become ancient. The world after the palaces was poorer in some ways, more dangerous in others, and less capable of organizing resources across long distances. But it was also a world of rebuilding. Small settlements could grow. Local leaders could gather followers. New communities could occupy abandoned land. Coastal traders could slowly rediscover routes that no longer depended on the old royal systems. And as generations passed, people experimented with materials and methods better suited to this fragmented landscape. Bronze did not disappear. It remained valuable, especially when old objects could be melted down and reused. But another metal was beginning to matter more. Iron was difficult to work, and at first it was not automatically better than bronze. Yet iron ore was far more widely available than the rare tin required for bronze. In a world where distant supply chains had failed, that fact would become increasingly important. The age that followed would not restore the old palace world. It would build something different from its ruins. Iron seemed like an answer, not an immediate answer. Not a miracle that suddenly put broken kingdoms back together, but an answer to one of the deepest problems of the old Bronze Age world. Bronze required copper and tin. Copper could be found in several regions around the Mediterranean. Cyprus had been one of the great suppliers. Anatolia had deposits. The mountains of the Levant and Egypt offered more. But tin was different. Tin came from farther away, through routes that could stretch across Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, perhaps even farther west toward Europe. The exact paths changed over time, and archaeologists still debate some of them. But the basic fact is clear. A bronze tool depended on a chain. Mine the copper, find the tin, move both across difficult terrain or dangerous water. Smelt them, mix them in the right proportions, cast the metal, then distribute the finished object to a farmer, soldier, carpenter, or palace workshop. When the chain broke, bronze became harder to replace. Old bronze did not stop being useful, far from it. Broken tools, damaged weapons, old ornaments, even statues could be melted down and made new again. In many communities, bronze may have become even more precious because every piece of it carried the possibility of another tool, another knife, another spearhead. But recycling has limits. Eventually there is less metal to recycle. Iron offered a different possibility. Iron ore was common compared with tin. It existed in many places where a community could reach it without sending ships across the entire known world. That mattered enormously after the collapse. A village did not need access to a faraway tin route to find iron-bearing rock in nearby hills. But iron was difficult. It required hotter furnaces, careful control of air, skilled smiths, and repeated hammering to remove impurities. Early iron could be soft, brittle, or inconsistent. A well-made bronze weapon was still a fine weapon, in some cases better than poorly made iron. The change was not a clean moment when humanity threw bronze into the sea and woke up in a new age. It was gradual. For generations, bronze and iron existed side by side. Bronze remained important for vessels, ornaments, fittings, and objects where its casting qualities were especially useful. Iron slowly became more practical for tools and weapons because its raw material was easier to obtain in a fragmented world. The new metal did not solve famine. It did not rebuild burned cities. It did not make roads safe, restore lost archives, or bring back the vanished courts of Hittite and Mycenaean Greece. What it did was reduce dependence on one particular kind of distant connection, and that gave smaller communities room to recover. A local ruler with access to iron ore and a capable smith had something the old palace system had often made difficult to imagine, a source of metal that was not entirely controlled by the great international network. Tools could be made closer to where they were used. Weapons could be supplied without waiting for ships from distant ports. Over time, ironworking knowledge spread from region to region, carried by craftspeople, trade, warfare, migration, and imitation. The world was still connected. It was simply learning how to connect again under different conditions. Along the Levantine coast, several old cities survived or recovered. Places such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblos and Arwad did not begin from nothing. They had deep roots in the Bronze Age past, traditions of seafaring, craft production and exchange. But in the centuries after the collapse, the cities later called Phoenician would take on a larger role in the Mediterranean. They did not form one unified Phoenician empire. Each was a city with its own rulers, merchants, temples, rivalries and alliances. Their people probably did not use the modern label Phoenician for themselves in quite the same way later Greeks did. But from the outside, these coastal communities became known for ships, trade, cedar timber, skilled crafts, and the famous purple dye produced from murex sea snails. Purple cloth was not an everyday product, making it required huge quantities of shellfish, long labour, and an appetite for a smell that was apparently unforgettable. The result was expensive fabric associated with wealth and power. But purple dye was only one part of a much larger commercial world. Phoenician merchants moved timber, wine, oil, metal goods, ivory, glass, ceramics, textiles, and luxury items. They connected ports that had once belonged to palace diplomacy with newer markets, newer elites, and new communities rising along distant coasts. This was not the old system returning exactly as it had been. In the late Bronze Age, trade had been heavily entangled with palaces. Kings exchanged gifts that were also political messages. Cargoes moved under royal protection. Great courts collected grain, textiles, metals, and labour, then redistributed them through their own administrative machinery. A ship could carry private goods, certainly, but it sailed through a world where major states shaped the rules. The newer networks were often more flexible. They depended less on a few enormous palace centres and more on many smaller ports, local rulers, merchant families, temples, workshops, and independent partnerships. That did not make trade peaceful or fair. Merchants still faced storms, piracy, tribute demands, and rulers who could change the rules overnight. But the system was less likely to depend on one palace remaining strong enough to manage everything. Instead of one giant web tied to a handful of royal knots, the Mediterranean was developing many smaller webs. If one route failed, another might remain. If one city fell, merchants could shift to another harbour. This is one reason the sea gradually became busy again. Not immediately, not everywhere. The recovery took centuries, and different regions moved at different speeds. Yet ships began to travel farther. New settlements appeared on islands and coastlines. Phoenician traders established outposts and colonies across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus and North Africa to Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, and beyond. Some were small trading stations, some became major cities. Carthage, traditionally founded by settlers from Tyre in the late 9th century BC, would eventually become one of the great powers of the Western Mediterranean. And, alongside goods, something else travelled: letters. The alphabet used by Phoenician scribes was not created out of nowhere. It developed from earlier Levantine writing traditions. But it was simpler than the large syllabic systems used in palace administration. It represented consonant sounds with a small set of signs, making it adaptable, portable, and easier to learn than a script requiring hundreds of symbols. It did not mean everyone suddenly became literate, but it meant writing no longer belonged only to the great palace archive. Merchants, craftsmen, officials, and local rulers could use it. Later, Greek communities adapted the Phoenician system, adding signs for vowels. From there, alphabetic writing would spread in forms that still shape the written world today. So the collapse did not end connectivity forever. It broke one kind of connectivity, fragile, centralized, dependent on royal storehouses, distant tin, and the cooperation of powerful states. Then, slowly, another kind emerged, less grand perhaps, less orderly, more crowded with small cities, ambitious traders, local kings, wandering craftsmen, and ships willing to gamble on an uncertain horizon. The connected seas had returned, but they belonged to a different world now. And that different world leaves us with a difficult question. What exactly had collapsed? It is tempting to imagine the late Bronze Age as a row of dominoes. One ship fails to arrive. A palace runs short of tin. Weapons cannot be replaced. Armies weaken. Enemies attack. Cities burn. Trade dies first. Then everything follows. There is truth in that image, but it is not the whole truth. The strongest evidence from the late Bronze Age shows a world tied together with remarkable intensity. Copper from Cyprus moved across the sea. Tin arrived from distant and still debated sources. Egyptian gold, Levantine timber, Canaanite jars of oil and wine, Mycenaean pottery, Anatolian textiles, ivory from Africa, glass from Egypt and Mesopotamia all travelled through overlapping routes. The Uluburun shipwreck remains one of the clearest snapshots of this system. Its cargo included copper ingots, tin ingots, glass, ivory, ceramics, weapons, jewellery and raw materials from multiple regions. One vessel, resting on the seabed, carrying pieces of a supply chain that stretched across kingdoms. Then there are the letters. Kings of Egypt wrote to kings of Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, Elashia, and the cities of the Levant. They asked for gold. They complained about delayed shipments. They arranged marriages. They exchanged gifts that were never merely gifts. A statue, a princess, a cargo of silver, a team of horses, all of it carried political meaning. The great powers depended on one another even when they distrusted one another. A Hittite king might need grain from Egypt during a shortage. Egyptian workshops might need copper from Cyprus. A Mycenaean palace depended on imported materials it could not simply pull from the soil outside its walls. A city such as Ugarit prospered because ships, merchants' envoys, and royal messengers kept arriving. This was interdependence, and interdependence made these societies rich. It allowed specialized economies to flourish. Cyprus could export copper. Regions with access to tin could feed metalworking far beyond their own borders. Palace workshops could produce goods of extraordinary complexity because they drew on materials, skills, and knowledge gathered from many places. Kings could maintain armies, build monuments, and distribute prestige objects because the wider world kept moving. But the same links could also transmit danger. If harvests failed in one region, grain demand rose somewhere else. If pirates, raiders, warships, or desperate migrants made a sea lane unsafe, cargoes stopped moving. If a kingdom fell into civil conflict, its partners lost not only a trading customer but an ally, a source of supplies, and perhaps the authority that kept roads open. The network did not need to break everywhere at once. It only needed to fail at enough critical points, and this is where the phrase "trade died first" needs to be handled carefully. In some places, long-distance exchange may indeed have weakened before palaces fell. Declining imports, fewer luxury goods, disrupted correspondence, and shortages of raw materials can appear as early warnings. A palace that could no longer acquire bronze, pay foreign allies, or feed its dependents was already in trouble, even if its walls still stood. But trade was not always the first cause. Sometimes war may have closed the routes. Sometimes drought and harvest failure may have made cargoes unaffordable or redirected ships toward grain. Sometimes political collapse meant there was no longer a king capable of protecting merchants, enforcing agreements, or organizing large shipments. Sometimes displaced people may have moved because their own worlds had already become unlivable, bringing conflict into regions that were themselves under strain. Trade could be the first thing to fail, or it could be the first visible sign that deeper failures were already underway. That is why scholars still debate the collapse. They debate dates because destruction layers do not all belong to the same year. One city burned early, another survived for decades. Egypt endured as a kingdom, though under immense pressure and with a much smaller reach beyond its borders. Assyria recovered and expanded in some areas. Cyprus changed but did not simply vanish. Inland communities and smaller settlements often adapted in ways the palace archives do not record. They debate causes because no single explanation fits every place. Climate evidence points to periods of drought in parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Texts speak of grain shortages. Archaeology records burned towns, abandoned centres, altered settlement patterns, and the disappearance of palace administration. Inscriptions speak of enemies and battles, but none of these pieces, on their own, explains the entire transformation. The collapse was probably not one disaster. It was a cascade. A world built for stability encountered shocks it could no longer absorb. Bad harvests made governments weaker. Weaker governments struggled to defend routes. Unsafe routes reduced supplies. Reduced supplies increased unrest. Unrest invited revolt, invasion, or migration. Each problem made the next problem harder to solve. The links between kingdoms had made them stronger for centuries. Then, under pressure, those same links became pathways along which crisis could travel. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson of all. No civilization is truly isolated. Every prosperous centre rests on relationships. It may barely notice. Fields beyond its horizon, miners in distant mountains, sailors crossing dangerous water, workers making tools, strangers honouring agreements made by rulers long dead. The late Bronze Age world was magnificent because it was connected. It was vulnerable for exactly the same reason, and when the ships stopped coming, the silence was not empty. It was the sound of a whole world discovering how much of itself had depended on everyone else. And after that silence came the long, uneven work of living without the old world. So did trade disruption help make the wider collapse possible? Almost certainly, but not by itself. The late Bronze Age was held together by dependencies so ordinary that they could become invisible. Bronze required copper and tin from different places. Armies required bronze. Palaces required grain, not only for kings but for workers, soldiers, craftsmen, scribes, and the families attached to them. Grain moved by cart and ship. Ships needed safe harbours, experienced crews, timber, officials, merchants, and political agreements between rulers who might not even like each other. Diplomacy depended on the same movement: a royal marriage, a gift of gold, a request for grain, a shipment of weapons, a message warning of danger. None of it mattered if the roads were unsafe, the ports were burned, or the people who kept records had fled. And palace administration sat at the centre of it all. Palaces collected harvests, counted animals, assigned labour, stored supplies, equipped armies, and redistributed food. They were not simply homes for kings. They were engines for organising complicated societies. But engines can be powerful and fragile at the same time. When the inputs stopped arriving, when taxes could not be gathered, when grain stores ran low, when regional officials no longer obeyed, the palace could become less a source of order than a place where every shortage became impossible to hide. Still, we should be careful. There was no single night when every ship vanished from every harbour. No single invading army, drought, earthquake, rebellion, or trade failure explains the fate of every kingdom. Different places suffered different combinations of pressure on different timelines. Some cities burned, some were abandoned, some survived in altered form. Some villages may have carried on quietly, growing food, repairing tools, raising children, and knowing little of the diplomatic world that had once linked great courts. For many people, collapse was terror, hunger, flight, violence, loss. For others, it may also have meant the end of palace demands, taxes, forced labour, and distant wars. The old order disappeared, but people did not disappear with it. They adapted, they gathered in smaller communities. They learned to work with different materials. They built new trade routes, new identities, new futures, and eventually ships came back, not carrying exactly the same world. That world was gone, but carrying the beginnings of another. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through the Bronze Age, please like, comment and subscribe. And tell us where you're listening from tonight. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify with a link in the description.